There was a theater at the edge of my hometown that everyone pretended not to notice. The road curved around it as if even the pavement wanted to keep its distance. Its faded marquee still carried broken letters from a movie that had ended decades before I was born. On quiet nights, one small bulb would flicker beneath the cracked sign, though no one had paid the electric bill in years. I found it by accident one autumn evening while driving home through a steady drizzle. The rain softened every sound until even my footsteps seemed borrowed from someone else. The air carried the faint scent of old velvet mixed with damp wood, and every window reflected a version of me that looked just a little slower than I was. My father used to tell me that abandoned places don't stay empty forever. They simply wait for someone willing to remember them. At the time, I laughed whenever he said that. Standing beneath the weathered entrance, I noticed the front doors weren't locked. They stood open only a few inches, breathing cool air that smelled like forgotten curtains and candle wax. Somewhere deep inside, something heavy shifted. Not loudly, but carefully enough to make me wonder whether I'd interrupted someone who thought they were alone. I should have turned around. Instead, I pushed the door open. That's when I realized the theater had been waiting for me. The rain had settled into a slow, steady rhythm by the time I stepped through the theater's front entrance. It was late October, just after dusk, and the last gray light of the evening clung to the cracked glass doors behind me. Outside, the parking lot had already disappeared beneath the fading sky. Inside, everything felt suspended between yesterday and a memory that had refused to fade. The lobby greeted me with rows of worn posters whose colors had long ago surrendered to time. Their corners curled away from the walls, revealing older layers beneath them. Dust drifted through pale light spilling from the broken marquee windows, turning each floating speck into something almost alive. The smell surprised me first. Not decay, not mold. It was a gentle scent of aged paper mixed with dried flowers, the kind my grandmother used to press between the pages of old books. For a brief moment, I was 8 years old again, sitting beside her while she read stories that always ended with someone finding their way home. That memory passed as quietly as it had arrived. I pulled my flashlight from my coat pocket, though I hardly needed it. Enough daylight remained to trace the outlines of the ticket counter standing at the center of the lobby. The polish would have lost its shine years ago. Small cracks spread across its surface like tiny rivers on an old map. Something rested on top. One small rectangle of faded paper. It lay perfectly straight. No dust covered it. That felt impossible. Every other surface carried the soft gray blanket of forgotten years. Yet the ticket looked as though someone had placed it there only moments before I arrived. I reached for it without thinking. The paper felt dry and surprisingly warm against my fingertips. The print had almost disappeared, but one line remained perfectly clear. Admit one. Beneath it was a name. Mine. I stood motionless for several seconds. Perhaps it belonged to someone else with the same name. Stranger things had happened. My mind searched for ordinary answers because ordinary answers are easier to carry than impossible ones. Then I looked closer. Beneath my name sat my birthday. Not the year, just the day and month. Exactly as my father used to write it on birthday cards. A quiet breath escaped me before I noticed I had been holding it. My father loved old theaters. Not because of the movies. He liked the silence that settled after everyone had gone home. He once told me that buildings remembered people longer than people remembered each other. I laughed when he said it. He never laughed back. Instead, he looked toward the empty stage of our town community hall and said, "Don't ever take something that belongs to a forgotten place. Forgotten things always know how to find their way home." Standing alone in that lobby, I wished I had listened more carefully. I turned the ticket over. Blank. No stamp. No seat number. Only smooth paper that had somehow survived decades without fading completely. Something on the far wall caught my attention. A large framed portrait hung above an old coat rack. It showed the theater during its grand opening. Men wore dark suits. Women smiled beneath elegant hats. Bright lights surrounded the entrance. I studied it for only a moment before looking back at the ticket. When I glanced toward the portrait again, something felt different. The crowd looked smaller. One figure near the entrance had vanished. I rubbed my eyes. The frame hadn't moved. The photograph hadn't changed. At least, that was what I told myself. The silence inside the theater seemed to deepen. Not empty silence. Waiting silence. My footsteps echoed softly across the tiled floor as I walked toward the portrait. Each step stirred tiny clouds of dust that sparkled briefly before settling again. The closer I came, the older the photograph appeared. Small cracks across the faces. The glass reflected my flashlight. And behind that reflection, for only an instant, I thought another person stood beside me. I turned so quickly my shoulder brushed the wall. Nothing. Only rows of empty benches and the ticket counter resting where I had found it. My pulse slowed little by little. Old glass plays tricks. Everyone knows that. I looked back at the portrait. The missing figure had returned. This time, someone near the ticket booth seemed absent instead. I counted the people twice, then stopped. There was no sense counting strangers who had lived before I was born. My flashlight flickered once. Only once. The light steadied again. Then another sound drifted through the lobby. Applause. It arrived from somewhere beyond the closed auditorium doors. Soft, distant, not loud enough to sound joyful. Just enough hands clapping together to suggest that something had reached its end. I held my breath. The applause continued for several seconds before fading into complete quiet. The building settled around me. Would creak somewhere overhead. A loose chain tapped gently against a flagpole outside. Nothing else. I looked toward the auditorium entrance. Darkness waited beyond the heavy doors. Every sensible part of me whispered that I should leave while I still could. Instead, my hand slipped almost absent-mindedly into my coat pocket. The ticket folded easily between my fingers. The moment it disappeared into the fabric, the applause ended. Not gradually, not as though the audience had finished. It simply ceased. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had heard all evening. Far down the hallway, where the lobby bent out of sight, a single door eased itself shut with a slow, careful click. The auditorium doors resisted at first, not because they were locked. They simply felt heavy, as though years of silence had gathered behind them, and did not wish to be disturbed. I leaned forward, pressing my shoulder against the old wood until they opened just enough for me to slip through. The room beyond was much larger than I expected. I stopped without meaning to. The rows of faded red seats stretched into the darkness, disappearing beneath the high balcony where broken railings caught the pale glow filtering through cracked windows. The stage waited at the far end beneath a curtain the color of dried wine, its folds hanging perfectly still. It should have felt abandoned. Instead, it felt paused. The faint scent of candle wax drifted through the room, warm and clean, as though someone had extinguished a flame only moments before I arrived. It reminded me of the little church my mother used to visit every winter. I hadn't thought about those mornings in years. Strange how a single smell can open a door in your mind that you forgot existed. My flashlight reached only a small part of the room. Everything beyond its beam remained soft and uncertain. I stepped into the aisle. The old carpet gave beneath my shoes with a gentle sigh. Dust floated lazily through the narrow light, rising and settling without hurry. The theater answered each step with a quiet echo. Then, nothing. No wind. No distant traffic. Only the kind of silence that makes you notice your own breathing. I followed the center aisle toward the stage. Seat numbers, once painted in gold, had faded until they were little more than faint circles. Some armrests leaned at odd angles. Others looked untouched, waiting for guests who had never returned. Halfway down the aisle, I noticed a number. 13. The seat itself looked no different from the others. Its fabric was worn. Its wooden arms were scratched by time. Yet something about it drew my attention before I understood why. It was moving. Not much. Only a slow, gentle rocking. Forward, back, forward, back. The motion was so slight I questioned whether my eyes were playing tricks on me. I stopped walking. The chair continued its quiet rhythm. There wasn't enough air moving through the room to stir a curtain, let alone an old theater seat. I waited. The rocking slowed, then stopped. The room settled once again. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and quietly laughed to myself. Old Springs, I thought. Buildings settle. With shifts. Everything has an explanation if you're patient enough to look for it. My father would have smiled at that thought. He always said explanations were useful until they weren't. I stepped closer. The faded number 13 rested on the side of the armrest beneath a thin layer of dust. Without thinking, I brushed the dust away with my fingertips. The wood felt warmer than the rest of the room. Not hot, simply lived in. I pulled my hand back. Some habits are difficult to break. Ever since childhood, I've touched old things without realizing it. Books in forgotten libraries, stone walls beside abandoned roads, weathered fences standing alone in empty fields. I always wanted to know where the places remembered being touched. Standing beside seat 13, I wish that habit had stayed in my childhood. A sound drifted across the stage. Not footsteps, more like fabric sliding across polished boards. My flashlight lifted toward the curtain. Nothing moved. The heavy velvet remained exactly where it had been. Still, something had changed. The darkness beneath the stage seemed deeper now, as though the empty space behind the curtain had quietly expanded. I looked away, then looked back. It appeared normal again. I told myself not to stare too long. Old buildings reward imagination. That was all. I continued toward the front row. The stage rose above me, its edge marked by cracked brass trim. Layers of dust softened every corner except one narrow strip leading toward the center. There were no footprints, only a clean path, as if someone swept it each morning before leaving. The thought settled into my mind without permission. Behind me, a voice whispered, soft enough to be mistaken for memory. It spoke my childhood nickname, the one only my parents ever used. I froze. Every muscle in my body became perfectly still. The whisper hadn't come from the stage. It hadn't come from the balcony. It came from directly behind the curtain. I waited. Perhaps another sound would follow. A cough, a laugh, anything. Nothing came. The theater returned to complete quiet. I turned slowly toward the stage. My flashlight rested on the curtain for several long seconds. Its heavy folds showed no movement, no outline, no sign that anyone stood behind them. My mouth felt dry. I considered calling out. The words reached my throat but never escaped. Some places seemed to ask for silence. This was one of them. Instead, I took one careful step backward, then another. The rows of empty seats watched without eyes. The balcony remained motionless overhead. Seat 13 stood exactly where I had left it, perfectly still, as though it had never moved at all. I reached the auditorium doors without taking my eyes off the stage. Only when my hand found the brass handle did I finally blink. The whisper never came again, yet the silence that remained somehow carried more weight than the voice itself. I opened the door just enough to slip through. Before letting it close, I found myself looking toward the curtain one last time. I wasn't searching for a figure. I wasn't expecting another whisper. I simply couldn't shake the feeling that someone behind the stage was listening for the sound of my footsteps fading away. The staircase to the projection booth hid behind a narrow service door beside the balcony. I almost missed it. The brass handle was cold against my fingers, and the hinges answered with a tired groan that echoed farther than it should have. A ribbon of cool air drifted down from above, carrying the unfamiliar scent of warm motor oil. It didn't belong in a building that had been abandoned for decades. For a moment, I simply stood there. I remembered helping my father repair an old lawnmower one summer afternoon. His hands were always stained with grease, no matter how carefully he washed them. He used to smile whenever I wrinkled my nose at the smell. Machines, he'd say, have memories too. You just have to know how to wake them. I climbed the stairs one careful step at a time. The wooden treads bent gently beneath my weight, each one speaking with its own quiet creak. Dust rested along the railing in thick lines, untouched by anyone for years. My flashlight swept across faded walls where old movie advertisements had peeled away until only fragments remained. At the top waited a heavy metal door. A small square window had been clouded by age, making it impossible to see inside. I wiped away a circle with my sleeve. The room beyond was empty, or so it seemed. I pushed the door open. The booth was smaller than I expected. A single projector faced a thick glass overlooking the auditorium below. Empty film reels rested on shelves that leaned slightly with age. A cracked wooden stool sat in the corner beside a narrow desk covered with faded notes whose writing had long since disappeared. Everything looked asleep. The smell of motor oil lingered in the air, stronger now, mixing with a dry scent of old cardboard. I walked toward the projector. It was a beautiful machine despite its age. Its brass fittings had dulled. Its paint had chipped away in tiny islands. One reel remained threaded through the mechanism, waiting exactly where the last projectionist had left it. I reached out but stopped before touching it. The ticket still rested inside my coat pocket. For reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't want to disturb another forgotten thing. A soft click broke the silence. I turned. Nothing had moved. Then another click. This one came from the projector itself. The large reel shifted a fraction of an inch. My breath caught. No power reached this building. The wires outside had been cut years ago. I'd seen them hanging loose beneath the broken utility pole when I arrived. The machine clicked once more. Slowly, the reel began to turn. Not fast, not smoothly, just enough to pull the brittle strip of film through the gate. The projector awakened with a gentle mechanical rhythm that seemed almost relieved to be working again. A pale beam of light spilled through the booth window, across the auditorium, onto the empty screen below. I stepped closer to the glass. Black and white images flickered into view. At first, they showed ordinary things. Children running across a park, a woman feeding birds beside a pond, a quiet neighborhood beneath spring sunshine. The picture shook gently with every frame. It looked like someone's family memories. Then the scene changed. A boy sat beneath a maple tree, reading a book with warm blue covers. I knew that tree. It had stood behind my elementary school until a storm knocked it down. The boy turned another page. My heart slowed. The jacket, the shoes, the small scar on his left hand. The boy was me. I stared at the screen without blinking. I had no memory of anyone filming that afternoon. In fact, I'd been completely alone. The image shifted again. Now I stood beside the creek behind my grandfather's house, skipping stones across calm water. I smiled after each throw, counting the ripples exactly as I used to. I remembered every second of that day, except one detail. The camera. Someone had been standing only a few feet away, watching, recording, yet I'd never seen them. Another scene appeared. I was older now, sitting alone in my apartment after my father passed away. A rainstorm tapped softly against the window while I held his old pocket knife in both hands. I remembered crying that evening. I remembered believing nobody would ever know how deeply I missed him. Yet the film had captured everything, even the moments I thought belonged only to me. My throat tightened. I looked behind me. The booth remained empty. The stool hadn't moved. The shelves stood exactly as before. Only the projector continued its steady work. The next image made my stomach sink. It showed this theater. The same cracked lobby. The same worn ticket counter. The date written in the corner was 30 years old. People crossed the entrance laughing together. A young projectionist leaned from this very booth. Then the camera drifted toward the front doors. A man stepped inside. He paused beneath the marquee, looked around, reached into his coat pocket. My fingers slowly closed around the ticket hidden inside my own pocket. The man lifted his face toward the camera. It was me, not older, not younger, exactly as I am now. The film burned white for an instant. The projector gave one tired cough. Everything stopped. The beam disappeared. Darkness settled gently across the booth once more. Only the faint ticking of cooling metal remained. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation. Old reels can be damaged. Light can deceive. Memory is not always honest. I repeated those thoughts until they sounded almost believable. Then I looked down at the floor. Fresh footprints crossed the dust behind me. They led to the booth door. Only one set. Mine. No tracks led back out. The projection booth stayed with me long after I left it. Even as I descended the narrow staircase, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to hear the projector begin again. It remained quiet. Only the old wooden steps answered my weight with gentle creaks that faded almost as soon as they were made. When I reached the main hallway, the theater felt different. Not larger, not darker, simply more familiar. That feeling unsettled me more than anything I had seen upstairs. It was the kind of comfort that arrives in the wrong place. The corridor beside the stage stretched ahead beneath a row of dim emergency lights that no longer should have worked. Their weak glow barely reached the faded carpet, leaving the corners wrapped in soft darkness. I followed it without deciding to. Sometimes curiosity isn't loud. Sometimes it simply keeps your feet moving. As I walked, the scent changed. The dry paper from the lobby had disappeared. So had the trace of motor oil. Now the hallway carried the smell of old cloth, like coats that had spent years inside cedar chests. It reminded me of the attic in my grandparents' house, where forgotten blankets and winter jackets waited through every summer. As a child, I loved searching that attic. Every box felt like it belonged to another life. My grandmother always laughed when she caught me trying on hats that had belonged to people I had never met. "Clothes remember," she once whispered. I smiled at the memory. Then the hallway bent gently to the left. A single work lamp burned ahead. Its yellow light pooled across the floor, steady and warm. There was no extension cord, no battery, nothing that should have powered it. Yet the lamp shone as though someone had switched it on only moments ago. Beyond it hung a heavy velvet curtain. Unlike the grand curtain on the stage, this one was smaller, patched in several places with careful stitches that had begun to fade. The fabric rested almost to the floor, its edges brushing the worn boards beneath it. It moved, only slightly, a slow sway that stopped before beginning again. No open window stood nearby. No breeze reached this part of the theater. I stood several steps away, watching. The movement continued, gentle, unhurried, almost thoughtful. For reasons I couldn't explain, I wasn't afraid. Not yet. I stepped closer. The smell of old fabric grew stronger, carrying the faint sweetness of forgotten perfume that had long since settled into the threads. The lamp cast a narrow strip of light beneath the curtain. Someone's shoes appeared there, small, black, perfectly polished. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. It felt strangely natural to kneel and look beneath the edge of the curtain. There was no one, only an empty costume room beyond. I rose slowly. The shoes were gone. For a moment, I wondered whether I had imagined them. Then I heard it, the quiet scrape of a needle passing through cloth. Back and forth, back and forth. It came from the other side. I gathered the edge of the curtain and eased it aside. The room was larger than I expected. Costumes hung from long metal racks, each covered with white sheets that softened their shapes into silent figures. Dust rested on dressing tables lined with cracked mirrors. An old sewing machine stood beneath the work lamp, though it wasn't the source of the sound. Near the far wall sat a woman. She occupied a simple wooden chair beside a basket overflowing with torn costumes. Her gray dress blended with the room around her. Silver hair rested neatly against the shoulders. Her hands moved with calm precision, guiding a needle through faded fabric. She never looked up. I waited for her to notice me. She didn't. The only sound was a gentle pull of thread through cloth. After several moments, I cleared my throat. The woman continued sewing. Then, in a voice no louder than a quiet evening conversation, she spoke. "You came later than I expected." The needle never stopped moving. A cool shiver passed through me. "Have we met?" I asked. She tied a small knot in the thread before answering. "No." A pause. "But I've been expecting you." The room seemed to grow smaller. Not physically, only in the way silence sometimes narrows a world. I searched her face for recognition. There was none. She worked as though mending the costume demanded every bit of her attention. "I think you have the wrong person," I said softly. This time, she smiled, only a little, without lifting her head. "No," she replied. "I almost never do." Her words settled into the room like falling dust. I wanted another question. Instead, one escaped without permission. "How do you know my name?" The sewing stopped. For the first time, absolute stillness filled the room. The woman rested the costume across her lap. Then she spoke my full name. Every syllable gentle, every syllable correct. Exactly the way my mother used to say it whenever she wanted my attention. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Before I could speak again, the needle slipped through the fabric once more. Back, forth, as though nothing unusual had happened. I looked toward the nearest mirror. Its cracked surface reflected the room. The lamp, the costume racks, me, the chair beside the basket. Empty. I turned immediately. The woman remained there, sewing quietly. I faced the mirror again. Only the empty chair. My breathing became slow and careful. The reflection offered no explanation. Neither did the room itself. After another minute, I stepped backward toward the doorway. The woman never tried to stop me. She never looked in my direction. Just before I reached the curtain, she spoke one final sentence. The tear was never in the costume. I waited. No more words followed. I let the curtain fall back into place. The lamp continued glowing behind the fabric. The soft sound of stitching faded little by little until it became impossible to tell whether I was hearing it or remembering it. I chose not to look behind the curtain again. I stood in the hallway for a long while after leaving the costume room. The curtain behind me hung perfectly still now, as though it had never moved at all. I listened for the gentle sound of the woman's needle passing through cloth, but the hallway offered only quiet. Even my own breathing seemed softer, careful not to disturb whatever had been left behind. I slipped a hand into my coat pocket. The faded ticket was still there. Its edges had become slightly warmer than the fabric surrounding it. I thought about throwing it away. The idea stayed with me for several seconds before fading. Something inside me resisted the thought. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It felt closer to obligation, though I couldn't have explained why. Ahead, the corridor opened onto the wings beside the stage. The smell changed again. This time it carried the faint scent of burning wood. Not smoke, not fire, just a lingering warmth of logs that had burned hours before, the kind of smell that clings to old jackets after an evening beside a fireplace. It reminded me of winter nights when my father and he would sit in silence, watching the flames instead of talking. He believed people didn't always need words to understand each other, that I missed that. More than I usually admitted. The backstage area stretched before me in a maze of ropes, painted scenery, and forgotten equipment. Large wooden flats leaned against the walls, each painted with faded streets, forests, and grand houses from productions no one remembered anymore. A single stage light flickered, then another. I stopped walking. A third light came alive, then a fourth. One by one, the overhead lamps awakened across the stage. No crackle, no spark, only a quiet bloom of warm light spreading across the empty boards. The auditorium beyond remained dark. Only the stage was illuminated. It looked ready for someone. I found myself stepping between the heavy side curtains almost without thinking. The old floorboards felt smooth beneath my shoes. Countless performances had polished them over the years until they reflected a faint golden glow from the lights above. For the first time since entering the theater, I could see the entire auditorium from the performer's point of view. Rows upon rows of empty seats disappeared into darkness. No movement, no voices, nothing. Then I heard one. A chair shifted somewhere in the distance. Just once. I looked toward the sound. Every seat remained empty. When I turned back toward center stage, I noticed someone standing several feet away. A man. His back faced me. He wore a dark suit that seemed just slightly too old for any fashion I recognized. One hand rested loosely at his side while the other held a script. Before I could speak, another figure entered from the opposite wing. Then another. A woman in a pale dress crossed the stage carrying a lantern that wasn't lit. A child followed her. An elderly gentleman adjusted his coat before taking his place. None of them acknowledged one another. None of them made a sound. More performers emerged until nearly a dozen stood beneath the warm lights. Their movements flowed naturally, like people rehearsing something they had practiced hundreds of times. Yet the silence remained complete. Their mouths opened. Their expressions changed. Arguments unfolded. Laughter appeared. Grief crossed their faces. But no voices reached me. It was like watching memories through thick glass. Then the rehearsal paused. Every performer slowly turned. Not together, one after another, until every face looked toward me. No anger, no surprise, only quiet recognition. The man holding the script smiled faintly. He lifted a single hand and gestured toward the center mark painted on the stage floor. An invitation. Without realizing it, I walked forward. Each step echoed gently across the boards. The performers parted to let me pass. As I reached the center, they surrounded me in a wide circle, still silent, still watching. The man in the suit held out the script. I hesitated before taking it. The pages felt surprisingly new. The cover carried no title, only 2 words, leading role. A strange chill settled across my shoulders. I opened the first page. The opening lines described a rainy autumn evening, an old theater, a lonely traveler. Every sentence matched my own arrival. Page after page, the script followed my movements through the lobby, the auditorium, the projection booth, and the costume room. Even the memories of my father appeared exactly as I had recalled them. I turned another page with trembling fingers. The next scene had not happened yet. It described me standing beneath the stage lights. Reading these very pages, looking toward an audience I believed was empty, my breath caught. Slowly, I lifted my eyes. The darkness beyond the footlights no longer looked empty. Figures occupied the seats. Hundreds of them, perhaps more. They sat perfectly still beneath the faint glow spilling from the stage. Their faces remained hidden beyond the edge of the light. I couldn't tell whether they were old or young, men or women, only that every seat was filled. No one moved. No one whispered. The silence felt expectant. I lowered my eyes to the script again. Only one page remained. It contained a single sentence. Take your bow. The performers around me stepped backward together, not hurriedly, almost respectfully, leaving me alone beneath the lights. I don't know why I did it. Perhaps because every eye seemed fixed upon me. Perhaps because some part of me already understood. I bowed. The moment I straightened, applause filled the theater. Warm, steady, endless. It washed over the stage like gentle rain, surrounding me from every direction. My chest tightened. I looked toward the audience. The seats were empty again. Every one of them. Only the applause remained. Then, as quietly as it had begun, the heavy curtain at the front of the stage drifted downward. It closed between me and the vacant auditorium with slow, graceful certainty. The applause stopped before the curtain reached the floor. On the other side, one seat creaked. The curtain remained closed between me and the auditorium. I waited, not because I expected it to rise again, but because a single creak from the other side seemed to leave something unfinished. It echoed faintly through the thick fabric before fading into the stillness. I stood alone beneath the stage lights until their warm glow began to feel unfamiliar. The script was gone. I looked down at my hands twice before accepting it. A moment earlier, I had been holding it. Now there was only empty air. The faded ticket remained safely inside my coat pocket, folded exactly as I had left it. Somehow that small discovery steadied me. It reminded me that not everything inside the theater disappeared without warning. I walked toward the wings. Beyond the curtains, the backstage corridor looked darker than before. The weak emergency lights had faded to a pale blue glow, barely enough to separate the walls from the floor. Near the end of the hallway, I noticed a narrow wooden door standing slightly open. I was almost certain it hadn't been there earlier. Above the frame hung a small brass sign. Dressing rooms. The letters had darkened with age. I hesitated. Then I remembered the woman with the needle. The tear was never in the costume. Her words had followed me ever since I left her room. Without knowing why, I pushed the door wider. A flight of stone steps disappeared into the darkness below. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the faint mineral scent of old masonry. It cooled my face after the warmth of the stage lights, making the theater above seem strangely distant. I switched on my flashlight. Its beam reached only halfway down. The rest of the staircase dissolved into quiet blackness. As a child, I always counted stairs. It became a habit after my father told me that counting kept fear from growing larger than it deserved. So I counted. 1, 2, 3. The numbers stayed calm inside my mind while my footsteps echoed gently ahead of me. By the time I reached 26, the staircase ended. The basement stretched farther than I expected. Low ceilings crossed with heavy pipes. Stone walls lined both sides of a narrow corridor. Old wooden benches stood outside dressing room doors whose painted numbers had almost vanished. The place smelled clean in an odd way. Not fresh, simply untouched, as though time itself had slowed beneath the stage. My flashlight swept across the nearest door. Its mirror had cracked from one corner to the other, dividing every reflection into uneven pieces. I stepped closer. The beam settled on my face. Tired eyes, rain-damp hair, the color of my coat slightly toned. Everything looked ordinary. Then I blinked. The reflection blinked too. A fraction later, so small that I almost dismissed it. I stared harder. Nothing, just my own face looking back. I let out a quiet breath and smiled at myself. "You're tired," I whispered. My voice sounded strangely small beneath the low ceiling. I turned away. The mirror answered with silence. The first dressing room held little more than broken chairs and empty clothing racks. Dust covered the floor in smooth layers that had not been disturbed for years. The second room contained cracked makeup tables beneath long mirrors spotted with age. Old light bulbs framed each mirror like tiny pearls. None of them worked. Yet one mirror reflected a faint glow. Not from my flashlight. Something softer, warmer. I moved closer. The glow faded before I reached it. My own reflection remained. Nothing more. The third room felt different. Its door stood open. Inside waited a row of tall mirrors facing one another across the room. Their reflections repeated endlessly into the distance. A familiar childhood memory surfaced. At county phase, I used to stand between mirrored walls and wonder which reflection reached forever. My father always pulled me away before I could find out. Some roads don't need walking, he'd say. I almost laughed remembering it. Almost. I stepped into the room. The mirrors multiplied everything. One version of me, then another beyond that. Hundreds stretching farther than my eyes could follow. I raised my flashlight. Every reflection copied me, except one. Far down the endless line, a single reflection lowered its light instead. I froze. The distant figure stood perfectly still. Then it turned, not toward another mirror, toward a doorway that didn't exist in the room. It walked away. The remaining reflections stayed exactly where they belonged. I rubbed my eyes. The endless corridor of mirrors returned to normal. Every version of me faced forward again. I backed slowly into the hallway. My heartbeat remained strangely calm, almost resigned. The basement had begun teaching me not to trust what my eyes offered first. A soft sound drifted through the corridor. Children laughing. Not loudly, only the brief, playful laughter of someone hiding during the game. It came from somewhere farther ahead. Then another voice joined it. Then another. The laughter bounced gently between the stone walls, making it impossible to know where it had begun. I followed it, only a few careful steps. The sound continued just beyond the next corner. When I reached it, the hallway ended. Bare wall, no doors, no passage. The laughter stopped, not gradually, as though someone had quietly closed a window. I remained there for several moments, listening. The basement gave nothing back. When I finally turned toward the staircase, I caught one last glimpse of the mirrors inside the third dressing room. They reflected the empty corridor, the open doorway, the quiet benches, and one solitary figure already halfway up the stairs. It looked exactly like me. I did not watch to see whether it reached the top before I did. The staircase back to the main level felt longer than I remembered. By the time I reached the hallway behind the stage, I could no longer hear the faint echoes from the basement. The silence above was different. It carried a softness that almost invited me to stay, as though the theater had grown accustomed to my footsteps. I rested one hand against the wall for a moment. The stone below had been cold. Hey, though it felt almost warm. I couldn't decide which troubled me more. The stage remained hidden behind the heavy curtains, and I had no desire to see it again just yet. Instead, I wandered deeper into the backstage corridors where the rooms grew smaller and the ceilings lower. Every turn revealed another forgotten corner filled with trunks, broken props, or shelves bending beneath years of neglect. One narrow passage ended at a supply closet. Its door stood barely open. A faded sign, hanging from one rusted screw, simply read, "Maintenance." I almost walked past it. Something stopped me. Perhaps it was a faint scent drifting through the doorway. Pine, fresh enough to remind me of old wooden cabins after rain, though no rain had ever reached this room. It mixed with a dry smell of settled dust, creating an oddly comforting feeling that didn't belong inside an abandoned theater. I pushed the door open. The closet was surprisingly neat. Shelves lined both walls, holding old paint cans, worn brooms, spare light bulbs, and neatly folded drop cloths. Whoever had worked here had believed in putting everything back where it belonged. My father admired people like that. He used to return every tool to its exact place before leaving the garage. If I put a wrench in the wrong drawer, he'd smile and quietly move it back after I walked away. Order, he once said, helps you notice when something changes. Standing inside the closet, I finally understood what he meant. One object didn't belong. A weathered notebook rested alone on a small wooden stool. No dust covered it. The dark leather binding had cracked with age, but the pages looked dry and intact. Someone had cared for it, or something had. I picked it up carefully. The cover carried no title. Only the faint outline of initials that time had nearly erased. The first page opened with neat handwriting. January 12th. Replaced a broken lamp in the east hallway. A pigeon found its way into the balcony again. Young man visited after sunset. I smiled faintly. The first two entries sounded exactly like the ordinary notes any janitor might write. Then I reached the third line again. Young man visited after sunset. There was no date beside it. No year. Nothing to place it in time. I turned the page. January 13th. He found the ticket. Kept it despite the warning. A chill settled quietly across my shoulders. I looked toward the doorway. The hallway beyond remained empty. The flashlight rested beside the notebook while I continued reading. Each page described simple maintenance alongside strange observations. Fix loose seat in row C. Woman in wardrobe continue sewing. Projector operated without assistance. Then, he climbed to the booth, watched the film, stayed longer than expected. Every sentence matched my movements. Exactly. I checked the earlier pages, searching for signs that someone had written them recently. The paper had yellowed with age. The ink had faded unevenly. Nothing suggested these entries were new. My fingers hesitated before turning another page. The handwriting remained calm, steady, almost gentle. He will reach the basement. The mirrors will confuse him. He will remember his father before leaving. I closed the notebook. My heart wasn't racing anymore. The fear had become quieter than that, more thoughtful, almost like listening to someone tell you something you already knew. I sat on the old stool. The pine scent lingered softly around me. For a few moments, I simply listened. The theater answered with distant settling sounds from somewhere high above. Nothing else. I laughed under my breath. Just once. It wasn't amusement, more disbelief than anything. If someone is writing this, I whispered into the empty room. They are doing a remarkable job. No reply came, only silence. After another minute, I opened the notebook again. Near the back, the entries grew shorter, less about repairs, more about me. He pauses before every unfamiliar doorway. He touches old wood without thinking. He misses conversations he never finished. That last line stayed with me. It was true. After my father died, I often thought about small questions I had forgotten to ask him. Nothing important, just ordinary things. His favorite movie, why he always looked toward empty buildings when we drove through town, whether he had ever been frightened of anything. The notebook seemed to know those thoughts. Or perhaps I had simply begun seeing myself inside every sentence. Only one page remained, blank, except for a single line written neatly across the top. The final entry belongs to him. Below it rested an uncapped fountain pen. Fresh ink shimmered on its nib. I stared at the empty page for a long time. The theater had already shown me impossible things. A ticket with my name. A film that remembered me. A woman who knew me. Mirrors that argued with reality. This should have surprised me. Instead, it felt like another quiet invitation. I picked up the pen. Its weight settled naturally into my hand. I lowered the tip toward the paper. Before it touched the page, footsteps crossed the hallway outside. Slow, measured, not approaching, not leaving, simply passing the open doorway. I looked up immediately. No one was there. When I turned back to the notebook, the page was no longer blank. A single sentence had appeared in careful handwriting. You stayed longer today. The ink was still drying. I gently closed the notebook without writing a single word. As I placed it back on the stool, I noticed something I could have sworn hadn't been there before. A second notebook rested beneath the first. Its cover was newer, and on the spine, written in faded gold letters, was this year's date. The newer notebook stayed in my thoughts long after I left the maintenance closet. I didn't take it. My hand reached toward it more than once, but something held me back. The first journal had known too much already. Carrying another one felt less like finding an object, more like accepting a responsibility I didn't understand. The hallway opened into the lobby again. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Thin drops clung to the tall windows, catching the faint glow of the streetlights beyond. For a moment I considered walking out through the front doors, driving home, and convincing myself that exhaustion had woven every strange moment into something larger than it really was. Instead, my eyes wandered across the street. A small diner stood opposite the theater. Its weathered sign leaned slightly to one side, the painted letters barely readable beneath years of faded color. I hadn't noticed it when I first arrived. Perhaps I simply hadn't been looking. A narrow crosswalk led toward it. The pavement glistened under the damp night, reflecting the pale light from the theater's broken marquee. The town felt unusually quiet, as if everyone had gone inside long before sunset. I crossed the road without meeting another car, without hearing another voice. The bell above the diner's door gave a gentle ring. As I stepped inside, warmth greeted me first. Not the sharp warmth of a heater, the comfortable kind that settles into old buildings after decades of welcoming travelers. Then came another surprise. Fresh coffee. Rich. Comforting. Impossible. The smell carried me back to Sunday mornings when my father would wake before sunrise. He never needed an alarm. I'd find him in the kitchen with a mug warming both hands while the rest of the house slept. He always claimed coffee tasted better before anyone spoke. The diner looked ready for customers. Red vinyl booths lined the windows. Sugar jars rested beside polished napkin holders. A pie sat beneath a glass dome on the counter, looking as though it had been baked earlier that evening. Yet there wasn't another soul in sight. Not at first. I wandered farther inside. Every chair stood perfectly straight. Not one carried the careless angle left behind by a recent customer. My footsteps sounded strangely soft across the black and white tiles. Then I noticed the clocks. One above the counter, one near the kitchen, another beside the entrance. 3 different clocks. Each showed exactly 8:17. None of them moved. I checked my watch. It read a little after 9. The second hand continued its quiet journey. The clocks on the wall refused to follow. I smiled to myself. Perhaps their batteries had died together. It wasn't impossible, just unlikely. A quiet clink interrupted my thoughts. Porcelain touching porcelain. I looked toward the counter. A white coffee cup rested there now. Steam drifted gently upward. I hadn't heard anyone place it there. Behind the counter stood a waitress. She wore a pale blue uniform with a neatly folded apron tied around her waist. Her dark hair was pinned carefully beneath a small paper cap that looked decades out of fashion. She didn't look at me. Instead, she wiped the polished counter with slow, practiced movements. Back and forth, back and forth. The cloth made almost no sound. I approached cautiously. "Evening," I said. She nodded once. No smile, no greeting. Just the smallest acknowledgement that I'd spoken. The coffee smelled wonderful. Fresh, strong, almost sweet. I didn't expect this place to be open. She folded the cloth neatly before setting it aside. It usually isn't. Her voice was calm, gentle, like someone answering a question she'd heard many times before. I glanced toward the windows. The theater stood across the street exactly where I'd left it. Its broken sign reflected faintly in the glass. "I've been exploring over there," I said, pointing toward it. She continued arranging cups without lifting her eyes. "I know." The answer settled between us. Simple, certain. I waited for her to explain. She didn't. Instead, she placed a small ceramic creamer beside the untouched coffee. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, only unusual. Finally, I asked a question that had been growing inside my thoughts. Do many people visit that theater? The waitress paused. Her hands rested lightly on the counter. When she answered, her voice became almost thoughtful. They visit once. Nothing more. No explanation. No story. Just 4 quiet words. I looked down at the steaming cup. A faint reflection shimmered across its dark surface. For an instant, it wasn't my face looking back. It belonged to someone older. The reflection blinked. Mine didn't. I lifted my head immediately. The coffee became ordinary again. Across the room, one of the clocks gave a single click. The hands hadn't moved. Yet I was certain I'd heard it. The waitress reached for the coffee pot. Before pouring another cup, she asked her first question. Softly, without looking toward me. "Why did you come back?" The words caught me completely off guard. "I've never been here before." She remained silent. Only the gentle sound of coffee filling another cup broke the quiet. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried no doubt. "That's not what I asked." A cool feeling settled into my chest. I searched my memory. I had never visited this town after moving away. Not once. At least, that was what I believed. Outside, the theater stood motionless beneath the dark sky. One small bulb beneath the old marquee flickered to life. The waitress set the coffee pot down. "I hope," she said almost to herself, "you remember sooner this time." Before I could ask what she meant, the bell above the entrance chimed softly. I turned toward the door. No one had entered. When I looked back, the counter was empty. The fresh coffee had disappeared. The waitress was gone. Only the 3 clocks remained, each one still waiting at 8:17. I stood inside the diner for another minute, listening for the sound of footsteps behind the kitchen door. Nothing came. The coffee cups remained neatly stacked behind the counter. The pie rested beneath its glass cover exactly as before. Even the cloth the waitress had used was folded with careful precision beside the register. It was as though she had never been there. I stepped back outside. The cool night greeted me with a gentle breeze carrying the clean scent of rain. Tiny drops still clung to the branches lining the street, catching the glow from distant lamps before slipping quietly onto the pavement. The theater waited across the road. Its dark windows reflected the empty town behind me. For a brief moment, I considered driving home. The thought stayed only long enough for me to picture the ticket inside my pocket. It felt heavier now, not physically, only in the way unfinished questions sometimes weigh more than answers. I crossed the street once again. The front doors opened with the same quiet resistance as before. Inside, the familiar lobby welcomed me with its faded posters and worn carpet. Somehow the building already felt less like a place I had entered and more like somewhere I had returned. That realization lingered longer than I wanted it to. Without thinking, my eyes drifted upward, toward the balcony. Earlier, it had disappeared into darkness. Now a faint wash of moonlight reached through a broken skylight above, spilling across the old railing like silver dust. Something about it invited my attention. I found the staircase tucked behind the lobby, narrow enough that 2 people could never have climbed it side by side. The wooden steps curved gently upward. Each one released a quiet complaint beneath my shoes. Halfway to the top, I paused. The theater below looked strangely peaceful from this height. Rows of empty seats stretched toward the stage. The curtain remained closed. Nothing moved. I continued climbing. The balcony smelled different from the rest of the building. The clean scent of rain drifted through the cracked stained glass windows, mixing with the cool night air. Small pieces of colored glass still clung to their frames, scattering pale patches of blue and amber across the faded carpet. It reminded me of the little train station where my father once waited with me during a summer storm. We spent nearly 3 hours there. He never complained. Instead, we counted raindrops racing each other down the windows. Funny how quiet places always seemed to draw him in. Perhaps that was why I kept thinking about him. Or perhaps the theater wanted me to. I stepped farther onto the balcony. The railing felt rough beneath my fingertips. Age had worn away the smooth finish, leaving tiny splinters that caught against my skin. Below, the stage remained empty. The footlights had gone dark. Only moonlight reached the polished floorboards now. I leaned forward. Something shifted near the back row. Not movement. Presence. I narrowed my eyes. At first, I thought the darkness was playing familiar tricks. Then shapes slowly separated from it. Figures. Dozens of them. They occupied nearly every seat along the balcony. Each sat perfectly upright, hands resting quietly in their laps. Their faces remained hidden beyond the reach of the moonlight. No whisper, no cough, no restless movement, only complete attention. They were watching the stage. Not me. At least, not yet. I counted the nearest row. 7 figures. The next held 6. Farther back, I lost track. There were simply too many. My breathing became slow and careful. Every sensible thought told me to leave the balcony. Instead, I remained where I was, watching them, waiting for one of them to move. None did. A floorboard settled somewhere behind me. I turned immediately. The staircase stood empty. When I faced the audience again, one seat had become vacant. I was certain it hadn't been before. The empty chair rested near the center aisle. Its faded upholstery looked slightly newer than the others, as though someone had only recently risen from it. I searched the nearby rows. No figure appeared to be walking away. No doorway stood open. Whoever had occupied that seat had simply gone. The thought settled quietly into my mind. Without warning, I realized something else. The remaining figures were no longer facing the stage. Every head had turned. toward me. The movement must have happened while I glanced at the empty seat. Yet I hadn't seen a single one turn. Hundreds of unseen faces rested in my direction. I couldn't distinguish eyes or expressions, only the unmistakable feeling that every bit of their attention now belonged to me. My throat felt dry. I wanted to step backward. My feet refused. The silence deepened until even my own heartbeat seemed distant. Then, from somewhere among the seated figures, a single hand lifted, not high, only enough to point, toward the stage below. The gesture lasted one quiet moment. The hand lowered. Nothing else moved. I looked where it had indicated. The stage remained empty, its curtains still closed. The polished floor reflected only moonlight. When I glanced back to the balcony, every seat was empty. The rows stretched quietly into the darkness once more. No figures, no movement, only faded red chairs waiting beneath broken windows. I remained there for several long breaths, trying to decide whether I had imagined the entire scene. Perhaps fatigue had begun shaping ordinary shadows into impossible things. Perhaps loneliness had made the theater feel more crowded than it was. I almost believed those explanations. Then I noticed the dust. Every seat carried a smooth layer untouched by time, except one, near the center aisle. Its cushion was perfectly clean, as though someone had been sitting there only moments before. I lowered my eyes. I did not look toward that seat again. Behind me, somewhere near the staircase, soft footsteps crossed the wooden floor. They moved away, not toward me, not in a hurry. By the time I found the courage to turn around, the balcony was empty once more. The footsteps had faded before I reached the staircase. I listened anyway. The balcony answered with nothing except the quiet settling of old timber. I told myself the sound could have come from the building itself. Wood expands. Wood contracts. Empty places often speak in small ways when the night grows colder. The explanation stayed with me until I reached the lobby. Then it quietly slipped away. The theater no longer felt like a place I was exploring. It felt like a place that had begun exploring me. I stood beneath the cracked marquee windows, looking toward the front entrance. Rainwater still clung to the glass outside, though the sky had begun to clear. The town beyond looked peaceful enough that anyone driving past would never guess what rested inside these walls. I thought about leaving. My hand even reached for the front door. Before I touched the handle, a green glow caught the corner of my eye. An exit sign. Perfectly ordinary. Except I was certain it hadn't been illuminated earlier. I turned toward it. The soft green light rested above a narrow hallway branching away from a lobby. Perhaps emergency batteries still worked after all these years. That seemed reasonable. Reasonable enough to follow. The hallway was long and straight, lined with framed posters whose colors had faded into pale ghosts of their former selves. My footsteps echoed softly across the tile floor, and the sound returned a little later than it should have, as though the corridor had quietly grown longer while I walked. At the far end waited another exit door. I pushed the crash bar. It refused to move. Locked. I frowned. The glowing sign above it continued shining peacefully. I turned around. The lobby should have been behind me. Instead, another hallway stretched away in the opposite direction. Different posters. Different wallpaper. The same green exit sign glowing at the end. I stood perfectly still. Perhaps I had taken a wrong turn. The theater had more corridors than I realized. I chose the second hallway. Its walls carried a faint metallic smell, subtle enough that I noticed it only after several steps. It reminded me of old copper coins my father kept inside a glass jar on his workshop shelf. Whenever I was little, I'd count them while he repaired bicycles for the neighborhood children. He never spent those coins. He simply liked knowing they were there. The memory made me smile. Only for a moment. The second exit door waited beneath another glowing sign. Again, I pressed the bar. Again, nothing happened. This time I didn't panic. I simply stepped backward, closed my eyes, counted to 5. When I opened them, the hallway remained exactly the same. I laughed quietly, not because anything was funny, because disbelief sometimes sounds like laughter. All right, I whispered, I understand. Though I wasn't sure what I understood. I turned once more. The corridor behind me had changed again. A torn movie poster hung crooked on the wall. The title had almost disappeared beneath water stains, leaving only a single painted eye staring outward from faded paper. Something about it felt familiar. I paused it. A minute later, I paused it again. Same tear, same missing corner, same painted eye. I stopped walking. My flashlight traced the edges of the frame. Dust rested undisturbed along the top. No footprints marked the floor except my own. I looked behind me. The hallway curved gently away. No poster. When I turned back, the framed advertisement was gone. Only bare wallpaper remained. A cool uneasiness settled over me. Not sharp fear. Something quieter. Like realizing you've forgotten an important appointment without knowing when or where it was supposed to happen. I continued walking. The green exit sign appeared once more. Closer this time. The door beneath it stood slightly open. Fresh night air drifted through the narrow gap. I could smell damp leaves carried on the breeze. Relief spread through my chest. At last, I crossed the hallway quickly and pushed the door wider. Outside waited. The theater lobby. The same ticket counter. The same faded posters. The same cracked entrance doors through which I had first arrived. I stayed without moving. Slowly, the exit door swung shut behind me with a gentle click. The sound echoed longer than it should have. I walked back toward the lobby. The ticket counter looked unchanged. Yet something rested upon it. A folded program. Its paper looked newer than everything around it. My name appeared neatly across the front. Beneath it, one line had been printed in elegant letters. Intermission. I opened it. Inside were only 2 sentences. The audience is enjoying the performance. Please remain in character. The paper slipped slightly in my hands. I looked toward the auditorium. Its heavy doors remained closed. No applause. No voices. Only silence. The kind that waits. I folded the program carefully and placed it beside the ticket already resting in my pocket. Neither object felt like it belonged to me, yet throwing them away no longer crossed my mind. Somewhere far beyond the lobby, deep inside the unseen parts of the theater, a bell rang once. Clear, gentle, like the signal that tells an audience intermission has ended. I did not follow the sound. I remained in the lobby long after the bell faded. My eyes stayed fixed on the closed auditorium doors, though I had already decided not to open them. Whatever waited beyond them had made its invitation clear enough. For the first time since arriving, I wanted to choose my own direction, even if the choice was only an illusion. The theater allowed me that much. At least, it seemed to. I wandered along a narrow passage beside the stage until I found another staircase leading downward. It was wider than the one that led to the dressing rooms, its handrail worn smooth by thousands of forgotten hands. A faint draught rose from below, carrying the rich scent of damp earth. It was unexpected. The smell belonged in a forest after rain, not beneath a theater. I rested my hand on the railing. For a moment, I almost turned back. Then I remembered my father telling me that fear often grows larger when you leave a door unopened. So I descended. The staircase curved gently until the light from above disappeared. My flashlight painted pale circles across old brick walls where moisture shimmered like tiny stars. Somewhere in the darkness, water fell one drop at a time. The sound was slow, almost peaceful. The stairs ended beside a narrow archway. Beyond it stretched a chamber I could never have imagined fitting beneath the theater. The ceiling rose much higher than the building above should have allowed. Stone columns stood in quiet rows, disappearing into darkness overhead. The floor was covered with a thin layer of soft soil instead of concrete, as though the earth itself had quietly reclaimed the place. My footsteps left clear marks behind me. I looked back once. Only once. The trail reminded me that I was still capable of leaving. That thought comforted me. At the center of the chamber lay the orchestra pit, or what had once been one. Its wooden edge remained, though the seats of musicians had long since vanished. The pit had filled with earth over the years until it resembled a shallow garden waiting for something to bloom. Nothing grew there, only silence. I approached carefully. The flashlight swept across abandoned music stands, each coated with a delicate layer of dust. Their pages had disappeared long ago, leaving only empty clips waiting to hold melodies that would never be played again. Then, a single violin string sang. One quiet note, clear enough that I felt it before I fully heard it. I stopped. The sound lingered for only a heartbeat before dissolving into the stillness. Another followed, lower this time, then a gentle breath from what sounded like a flute. No musician stood before me. The instruments rested exactly where they had been left. Yet one by one, they found their voices. A cello answered, then a piano somewhere beyond the reach of my light. Each note arrived with careful restraint, never rising into a full performance. It felt less like music and more like people clearing their throats before speaking. I closed my eyes. The melody stirred something deep inside me. Not recognition. Memory. I was 12 years old again, sitting in the back seat of my father's truck on the drive home from my first school concert. I had played only 3 simple notes on a recorder, and even those had come out wrong. I apologized the entire way home. My father laughed. "You don't remember music because it's perfect," he told me. "You remember it because someone cared enough to play it." I hadn't thought about that night in years. The memory settled over me with surprising warmth. When I opened my eyes, the chamber looked unchanged. The music continued. Soft, patient, almost kind. Then another memory surfaced. Not invited. My mother's voice reading beside my bed while rain tapped against the windows. The smell of fresh paint in our first house. The tiny scar on my knee from falling off a bicycle. Moments I hadn't visited in decades arrived one after another, carried gently by each new note drifting through the underground room. I found myself smiling. Then the melody changed. One note slipped slightly out of place. Another lingered too long. The warmth began to fade. A different memory emerged. The hospital room. My father's empty chair. The silence after everyone else had gone home. I remembered standing beside the window, trying to convince myself that grief would eventually become smaller. It never truly did. The cello answered with a long, low tone that seemed to understand. I lowered my flashlight. The orchestra pit remained empty. No hands held the instruments. No bows crossed the strings. Yet the music continued. Behind me, someone clapped. One pair of hands. 3 slow applauses. Nothing more. I turned immediately. The chamber stretched away behind me exactly as before. Stone columns. Soft earth. My own footprints. No one stood there. The applause did not return. I waited. The music faded little by little until only the distant sound of falling water remained. I looked back toward the orchestra pit. Every instrument rested in complete silence. One music stand now held a single sheet of paper. I was certain it had been empty before. I stepped closer. The page contained only a few handwritten lines. Not musical notes. Words. In my father's handwriting. Some performances are meant to be heard only once. I traced the edge of the paper with one finger, but didn't pick it up. Some things feel less frightening when they remain where you found them. I turned away from the pit. As I walked back toward the staircase, I noticed something that made me stop. My footprints still led into the chamber, but beside them, another trail had appeared, matching my pace, keeping perfectly alongside mine, beginning exactly where the music had started. They continued all the way to the foot of the stairs. One step ahead of me. The second set of footprints ended at the staircase. Mine continued upward. The others did not. They stopped neatly at the bottom step, as though whoever had walked beside me had decided they had gone far enough. I stood there for a long moment. My flashlight rested on the prints until the battery dimmed for an instant, then steadied again. When the light returned, the extra footprints looked softer around the edges, not disappearing, only becoming part of the earth again. I climbed back toward the theater. Each step carried me farther from the scent of damp soil until it was replaced by something lighter, something familiar. Lavender. The fragrance drifted gently through the hallway above, delicate enough that I almost mistook it for memory. My mother kept dried lavender in small cloth bags inside her dresser drawers. Every spring she tucked fresh bundles between folded sweaters, saying that certain smells could make a house feel kinder. I hadn't smelled it since we emptied her home years ago. The hallway seemed to guide me toward it. A narrow door stood open near the end of the corridor. A brass plate beside the frame had been polished so often that only one word remained visible. Found. The rest had worn away. Inside waited a long room lined with wooden cabinets. Some were no larger than jewelry boxes. Others stood nearly as tall as I was. Every drawer carried a tiny handwritten label. Umbrellas, scarves, gloves, books, letters, keys. The theater had once kept careful track of everything its visitors had misplaced. I stepped inside. The lavender scent grew warmer, blending with a faint aroma of old cedar from the cabinet shelves. Dust rested quietly on the floor, untouched except for a single path leading deeper into the room. I followed it. The first drawer I opened held a child's mitten, blue wool. One button I had fallen from the little bear stitched onto the back. The second contained a pair of reading glasses folded with remarkable care. The third held nothing more than a train ticket from a town I'd never visited. Each object seemed ordinary. Each carried the quiet feeling that someone had once searched desperately for it. I closed every drawer exactly as I had found it. My father believed borrowed things should always be returned in better condition than you received them. Old habits survive even in strange places. Near the back wall stood a cabinet unlike the others. Its wood had darkened with age, and a tiny brass lock hung from one door. It wasn't locked. The latch lifted with almost no effort. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Boxes, photographs, pocket watches, small toys, dozens of forgotten lives arranged with impossible care. Then I saw it, a silver pocket watch resting alone on a square of faded velvet. My breath caught. I knew the scratch across its cover, the tiny dent near the hinge, even the broken chain. It belonged to my grandfather. After he died, my father searched every room in the house for weeks. He believed the watch had simply been misplaced during the move. We never found it. Until now, my hand hovered above it. The theater had taught me caution. The ticket, the notebook, the impossible film. Every gift seemed to ask for something in return. Still, I reached down. The metal felt cool against my fingertips. Not cold, just quietly waiting. With gentle care, I pressed a release. The cover opened. Inside was no clock face, only a tiny photograph. My father, much younger than I remembered, standing in front of this very theater. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a little boy, perhaps 8 years old. Both smiled toward the camera. The boy wore a wool coat with one missing button. I stared at him for several seconds. Then recognition settled over me. It was me. The photograph couldn't exist. I had never visited this theater as a child. At least, that was the story my memory continued telling. I closed the watch. Slowly, carefully, behind me, one of the cabinet drawers slid open with a soft wooden whisper. I turned. No one stood there. The drawer remained half open. Inside rested a folded red scarf. Nothing more. I crossed the room and pushed it shut. The wood clicked gently into place. Another drawer opened. Then another. Not all at once. One. Then silence. Another. Then silence again. Each movement happened somewhere different, as though unseen hands wandered quietly through the room searching for something they had forgotten. I remained perfectly still. The lavender fragrance lingered around me, strangely comforting despite everything else. The drawers continued opening. A glove, a book, a small music box, an old photograph. None stayed open for long. Each eased shut before the next one moved. The room had settled into its own quiet rhythm, almost like breathing. I looked down at the pocket watch still resting in my palm. My grandfather used to wind it every evening before dinner. He claimed clocks disliked being neglected. I smiled without realizing it. Then I remembered. There had been no clock inside, only the photograph. A soft tick reached my ears. I frowned. Another tick followed. The watch had begun keeping time again. I slowly opened the cover. This time, the clock face had returned. Its delicate hands moved smoothly beneath the cracked glass. The time read 8:17, exactly the same as every clock inside the diner. The ticking continued, steady, calm, almost reassuring. Until it stopped, the second hand froze. Every drawer in the room closed together. Complete silence settled over the cabinets. I slipped the watch carefully back onto the velvet cloth. Some belongings have already found where they belong. As I stepped away from the cabinet, I caught my reflection in the polished glass of another display case. For a brief moment, someone stood beside me, not close enough to touch, only close enough to be noticed. When I turned, there was no one there. I chose not to look back at the reflection again. The whole way outside the lost and found room felt quieter than before. Not emptier, just quieter, as though the theater itself had paused to listen. I closed the door gently behind me. The brass plate caught the beam of my flashlight for a moment before disappearing into the dim corridor. The faint fragrance of lavender stayed with me for several steps before giving way to another familiar scent. Dust, warm and dry. The kind that hangs in the air when sunlight slips through an old attic window. I followed it without thinking. The passage narrowed until heavy curtains appeared on both sides, separating the backstage corridors from the performance area. Beyond them, a pale glow spread across the floorboards. The stage lights were on again. I hadn't heard them awaken. They simply were. One curtain stood slightly open, leaving a gap no wider than my shoulder. I looked through it. The stage was occupied, not by an audience, by actors. 5 of them stood beneath the lights. A woman in a long gray dress, an elderly man carrying a cane, a child with neatly combed hair, a tall gentleman in an old-fashioned coat, and another figure standing perfectly still near the center. None of them spoke. Their movements flowed with quiet purpose, each gesture answering another as though they were performing lines I could not hear. The silence made the scene more unsettling than any voice could have. I watched for nearly a minute. No one looked toward me. The actors crossed the stage with graceful precision, pausing exactly where invisible marks seemed to guide them. Then the central figure stepped forward. Something about him felt unfinished. He wore a dark suit pressed neatly against his thin frame. White gloves, polished shoes. Everything appeared ordinary except his face. There wasn't one. Not blank skin. Not darkness. Simply an absence where every feature should have been. The light reached his head, his color, his hair, then stopped, as though the theater itself refused to reveal whatever belonged there. I should have looked away. Instead, I found myself studying him even more carefully. The other performers treated him as though nothing were unusual. The elderly man handed him a folded letter. The woman smiled warmly. The child reached for his hand. Each gesture carried the quiet familiarity of people who had rehearsed together for years. The faceless actor accepted every moment naturally. He nodded. He bowed. He laughed without sound. No one hesitated. Only I did. A memory drifted into my thoughts. When I was 16, I played a tiny role in a school play. I had only one line. I forgot it. Standing beneath the bright lights, I froze completely while the audience waited. Afterward, I apologized to my father the entire drive home. He smiled and said, "Most people won't remember what you said. They'll remember how you carried yourself." I never stood on another stage after that. Watching these silent performers, I wondered whether he had been right. The rehearsal continued. A chair was brought to the center. The faceless actor sat there. The others gathered around him. One pretended to pour tea. Another opened an imaginary book. The child pointed toward the empty auditorium as though showing him something wonderful. It felt less like a performance and more like a family remembering an ordinary afternoon. Then, every actor stopped moving, at exactly the same moment. The stillness settled over the stage so completely that I wondered whether time itself had paused. Slowly, the faceless actor stood. He turned, not toward the audience, toward the narrow opening where I stood behind the curtain. There were no eyes to meet mine, no expression, yet I knew he had found me. The other actors remained frozen where they were. Only he moved. One quiet step, then another. His polished shoes made almost no sound against the wooden boards. I didn't retreat. I couldn't. He approached until only a few feet separated us. Then he stopped. The stage lights warmed the edge of the curtain between us. Neither of us moved. After several long breaths, he raised one gloved hand. Not in warning, not in greeting. He offered a slow, respectful bow. The gesture carried a strange sadness, almost gratitude. Without thinking, I bowed in return. When I straightened, he had stepped back. The rehearsal resumed. The woman laughed silently. The child ran across the stage. The elderly man tipped his hat. Everything continued as though nothing had interrupted them. I let the curtain fall closed. For a long time I simply stood there, listening to the silence beyond the fabric. Eventually I gathered enough courage to look once more. The stage was empty. Every light remained on. No actors, no chairs, nothing. Only a single script rested on the floor where the faceless performer had been standing. I crossed the stage slowly and picked it up. The cover bore no title. Inside, every page was blank, except the final one. There, In neat handwriting appeared a single sentence. The face is always the last thing the theater remembers. I closed the script gently. Its paper felt older than it looked. As I turned to leave the stage, I noticed the dust beneath the lights. 5 sets of footprints crossed the floorboards, one for each performer. They led toward the wings. All except one, the 6th trail, led directly to where I was standing. The script remained in my hands as I stepped away from the stage. I wasn't sure why I carried it. Every sensible part of me knew it belonged to the theater, just as the ticket and the program had seemed to belong here. Yet my fingers refused to let it go. The blank pages felt strangely light, as though they held less paper than they should have. When I reached the backstage hallway, I slipped it beneath my arm. The stage lights dimmed behind me, one after another, not all at once. Each fading lamp left the theater a little quieter, until only the faint glow of the emergency lights remained. I followed a corridor I hadn't noticed before. The walls narrowed gradually, guiding me toward a heavy steel door painted bright red beneath years of chip paint. Above it hung a weathered sign. Fire exit. The words looked ordinary enough. For the first time since entering the theater, something resembled a clear way out. I smiled to myself. Perhaps the strange maze of hallways had simply hidden this door until now. Perhaps leaving really was that simple. The metal push bar felt cool beneath my palms, but IT gave way with surprising ease. The door swung outward. Cold air rushed in, sharper than anything I'd felt inside the theater. It carried the crisp scent of winter grass touched by frost. Not snow, not ice, just a clean stillness that arrives before sunrise on the coldest mornings. I stepped outside. At least, I thought I had. The parking lot was gone. So was the road, the diner, the town. Everything had disappeared. Before me stretched an open field covered in pale frost that shimmered beneath a silver moon. Long blades of frozen grass bent gently in the breeze, whispering against one another with a dry, delicate sound. The sky above held more stars than I had ever seen. No buildings interrupted the horizon. No telephone wires. No distant lights. Only endless fields reaching toward dark woods far away. I looked back. The theater stood behind me, exactly as before. Its faded marquee glowed softly against the night. The red exit door remained open. Warm light spilled across the frozen ground. I should have gone back inside immediately. Instead, I took a few careful steps into the field. The frost crunched softly beneath my shoes. Each breath drifted away in small white clouds. As a boy, I loved walking through empty fields before anyone else had disturbed the morning frost. My father always insisted we leave before sunrise so we could be the first to cross them. He claimed untouched ground carried a kind of honesty. Every footprint told the truth. The memory stayed with me while I looked down. My footprints stretched neatly behind me, one after another. Simple, expected. Then I noticed another trail. It began several feet ahead. Not beside mine. Ahead. Someone had already crossed the field before I arrived. The footprints looked fresh, perfectly preserved in the frost. I followed them with my eyes. They continued toward the distant woods, evenly spaced, calm, unhurried. Then they stopped, not because they reached another path, not because they turned. They simply ended in the middle of the field. Beyond the last print, nothing. The untouched frost stretched endlessly forward. I remained where I was. The breeze moved quietly through the grass. Far away, an owl called once before the silence returned. I considered walking to the place where the footprints vanished. Something deep inside me advised against it. Not fear, respect. There are places that seem to ask only one thing of us, to leave them undisturbed. I lowered my eyes. When I looked back up, a new footprint had appeared. Not at the end of the trail. Closer, only a few yards away. Facing me. I hadn't seen it form. It simply existed now. Another appeared. Then another, each one arriving a little nearer than the last. No sound accompanied them. The frost remained perfectly still. Yet the line of footprints continued growing between us, one quiet step at a time, until only a single untouched patch of frozen grass separated the nearest print from my own boots. The trail ended there. I looked up instinctively. The field remained empty. No figure crossed the moonlit plain. No movement disturbed the tall grass. Only the footprint suggested anyone else had ever stood there. A slow shiver passed through me, not from the cold, from the certainty that someone had walked all the way to me without leaving anything visible behind. My fingers tightened around the blank script. The paper made the softest rustling sound. I glanced down. The final page was no longer blank except for its single sentence. A second line had appeared beneath it. Some exits remember where you came from. I read it twice. The words offered no explanation. Only another quiet mystery. The wind shifted. A single blade of frozen grass brushed against my coat. The touch startled me enough that I looked toward the woods again. For the briefest moment, someone stood at the edge of the trees, too distant to recognize, perfectly motionless. Before I could focus, the figure stepped backward, not turning away, simply retreating into the darkness between the trunks until nothing remained except the quiet outline of the forest. I waited. Nothing returned. The open fire exit behind me spilled its warm light across the frost, forming a bright path back toward the theater. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight toward the doorway. As I crossed the threshold, I glanced once more at the field. The footprints had disappeared. Every one of them. Only my own remained. The fire door closed gently behind me with a deep metallic click. I didn't reach for the handle. Some doors feel less frightening when they stay closed. The sound of the fire door closing followed me through the hallway. Not loudly, just enough to remind me it had sealed itself without my help. I didn't look back. There was nothing waiting for me in that frozen field now except my own footprints, and even they would probably be gone by morning. If morning ever reached this place. The theater welcomed me with familiar silence. After so many hours inside its walls, I had begun to recognize its moods. The lobby no longer felt like a stranger's house. The backstage corridors no longer asked permission before I entered. That realization should have comforted me. Instead, it left an empty feeling somewhere beneath my ribs. I walked without choosing a direction, past the ticket counter, past the maintenance closet, past the dressing rooms where the woman had continued sewing without once lifting her eyes. Every place seemed to remember me. Every hallway felt slightly shorter than before. Then I noticed a light, warm, golden, pouring from beneath the auditorium doors. I stopped. Earlier, only the stage had been illuminated. Now the glow spread across the hallway carpet as though an entire performance waited beyond it. The brass handles turned easily beneath my hands. The doors opened. The auditorium was no longer dark. Every chandelier shone with a gentle amber light. The balconies glowed softly. The stage curtains had been drawn apart. Not a single bulb flickered. The room looked exactly as it must have on opening night many decades ago. Beautiful. Almost impossibly so. The familiar scent of polished wood had vanished. In its place drifted a delicate fragrance of fresh perfume. Not overpowering. Only enough to suggest that people had gathered here moments before I arrived. I stepped inside. The carpet muffled my footsteps. The seats stretched toward the stage in neat rows, their faded fabrics somehow richer than I remembered. Everything looked restored. Almost alive. Then I saw them. The audience. Every seat was occupied. Hundreds of people sat quietly beneath the warm lights. Men in dark coats. Women wearing elegant dresses. Children leaning patiently against their parents. No one whispered. No one shifted in their seat. They simply waited. From where I stood, I couldn't make out their faces clearly. Only calm outlines softened by distance. I should have left. Instead, I found myself walking down the center aisle. No one acknowledged me. The silence felt strangely respectful, as though arriving late to an important performance. Halfway to the stage, I noticed something impossible. Several faces looked familiar. An elderly neighbor who had disappeared when I was a teenager. The owner of the old bookstore near my childhood home. A school teacher whose funeral I remembered attending. Each sat quietly among the others. None appeared older than the day I last remembered them. The farther I walked, the more familiar faces appeared. People from newspaper articles. Missing person posters. Photographs my father had shown me years ago. Every face belonged to someone who had once vanished. Not dead, simply gone. My breathing slowed. The audience remained perfectly still. The stage stood empty before them, waiting. Then, almost together, every person rose to their feet. The movement happened so smoothly it resembled a wave crossing the auditorium. No chairs scraped the floor. No clothing rustled. Only quiet motion. I remained frozen in the aisle. One by one, they began applauding, gentle at first, hands meeting with measured rhythm. The sound spread through the theater until it surrounded me from every direction. Warm, steady, endless. It wasn't joyful. It wasn't mocking. It carried something closer to gratitude, as though they had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. I looked toward the stage. Empty. No performer stood beneath the lights. Then I realized something. The applause wasn't meant for the stage. It was meant for me. My heart felt strangely calm. The fear that had followed me through the theater seemed to have reached its limit. Beyond it waited something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps, or simple exhaustion. I lowered my eyes. Near the front row sat one empty seat. Only one. Its red upholstery looked untouched. A small brass plate gleamed softly along its armrest. I walked closer. Each step echoed beneath the continuing applause. The brass plate carried no seat number, only my name. I stopped beside it. The applause continued. No one looked away. Every face remained turned toward me. For the first time since entering the theater, I could see them clearly. Their expressions weren't frightening. They weren't smiling. They simply looked peaceful, as though they had all reached the end of a very long journey. The empty seat waited. Patiently, I remember my father's voice. Not clearly, just one sentence drifting gently through memory. Every audience waits for someone. I never understood what he meant. Until now, I reached toward the seat. My fingers brushed the worn velvet. It felt warm, as though someone had only recently stood up. Before I could decide whether to sit, every light in the theater dimmed. The applause stopped. Not gradually, completely. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across every row. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the chandeliers stood motionless overhead. I looked back toward the audience. Every seat was empty. The elegant dresses, the familiar faces, the missing people, all gone. Only dust remained. The warm perfume had disappeared with them. The theater had become old again, quiet again, forgotten again. I stood alone beside the single empty seat bearing my name. I didn't sit down. Not yet. Some choices become heavier the longer you carry them. As I stepped slowly away, something brushed against the back of my coat. Softly, like fingertips grazing fabric. I kept walking. I never turned around to see who had been standing behind me. I left the auditorium without looking back at the seat. Its brass plate had carried my name with quiet certainty, as though it had been waiting there long before I ever crossed the theater's threshold. Even after the doors closed behind me, I could still picture it resting beneath a thin layer of dust. Some memories refused to stay where they happened. They walked beside you. The whole way felt unusually calm. The emergency lights cast a gentle glow across the faded wallpaper, and for the first time all evening, I noticed how carefully the place had been built. Every corner curved smoothly. Every doorway lined up with another farther down the corridor. Whoever designed the theater had wanted people to move through it without thinking. I wondered how many had. A narrow staircase caught my attention near the manager's office. It climbed toward the upper floors, disappearing into darkness above the ceiling. I was almost certain it hadn't been there before. The wooden banister felt smooth beneath my hand, polished by years of use. Each step answered with a quiet creak that seemed less lonely than the sounds elsewhere in the building. The air grew warmer as I climbed. Then another scent found me. Old linen, freshly folded once upon a time, now carrying the gentle fragrance of cedar that had lingered through countless seasons. It reminded me of opening the guest room closet at my grandparents' house every Christmas. The blankets always smelled exactly the same. Safe, familiar, almost enough to make a child believe nothing bad could happen while wrapped inside them. The staircase ended at a long hallway. Small brass numbers rested beside evenly spaced doors. Hotel rooms. I stopped walking. The theater had never looked large enough to hold another floor, let alone an entire hotel. Yet the hallway stretched ahead with quiet confidence, disappearing around a distant corner. Soft carpet replaced the old wooden floors. Wallpaper decorated with tiny golden flowers covered the walls. Table lamps glowed gently beside every third door. None of them should have had electricity. I walked slowly. Each room stood slightly different from the last. One door carried fresh polish. Another showed scratches around the handle. A tiny luggage cart rested abandoned near room 209, its wheels perfectly clean despite the dust everywhere else. I paused outside room 211. The door stood open just enough to reveal darkness inside. Without really deciding to, I knocked. 3 gentle taps. No answer. I eased the door wider. The room looked as though someone had checked out only yesterday. The bed had been neatly made. A suitcase rested open on the luggage stand. Fresh towels hung inside the bathroom. The curtains stirred almost imperceptibly, though the windows were closed. I stepped inside. The cedar scent settled around me with surprising warmth. On the bedside table stood a glass of water, half full. No dust floated on its surface. The lamp beside it cast a soft amber circle across the room. I reached toward the suitcase, then stopped. Somehow it felt too personal. Instead, I wandered toward the dresser. A framed photograph rested there. It showed the room itself. The same bed, the same lamp, the same window. Only one difference. Someone slept beneath the blankets. The figure lay facing the wall, wrapped almost completely in the covers. I frowned. The photograph felt oddly recent. As I looked up from the frame, the bed behind me creaked gently. I turned. The blankets remained perfectly smooth. No one lay there. I told myself old mattresses settle on their own. They always have. Still, I found myself watching the bed a little longer than necessary. A wardrobe stood open near the far wall. Inside hung several coats. One immediately caught my attention. Dark gray wool. The left sleeve slightly frayed near the cuff. It looked exactly like the coat I wore during my first winter after college. I stepped closer. The pockets sagged naturally, as though they still carried forgotten belongings. Without thinking, I reached inside. My fingers touched paper. I slowly pulled out a photograph. It showed me, sleeping in this very room. The date printed neatly in one corner stopped my breath. It was 15 years earlier. I stared at it until the numbers blurred. That couldn't be possible. 15 years ago, I had been living hundreds of miles away, working my first job, struggling to remember to pay rent on time. I'd never visited this town, never stayed in this hotel. Never, had I? A quiet knock echoed through the room. 3 soft taps. From inside the hallway, I placed the photograph back into the coat pocket. When I opened the door, no one stood outside. The hallway remained empty beneath its warm lamps. Only silence waited there. I stepped into the corridor. As I pulled the door shut, something inside caught my eye. The framed photograph on the dresser had changed. The bed was no longer empty. Someone slept beneath the blankets again. This time, the figure had rolled over, facing the camera, facing me. Even from the hallway, I recognized my own face. Peaceful, asleep. The door drifted closed before I could look any longer. Its latch clicked softly. I didn't try to open it again. Farther down the hallway, another hotel room stood open. Then another. Each one glowed with the same quiet warmth. Each one looked ready for a guest who had only stepped out for a moment. I continued walking. The carpet softened every footstep until I could barely hear myself moving. Near the end of the hallway, I glanced back. Every hotel door had closed. Every lamp had gone dark. Only room 211 remained faintly lit beneath its door. From somewhere inside, muffled by walls and distance, came the gentle sound of someone turning over in their sleep. I kept walking. I chose not to find out whether they were dreaming or remembering. The hallway behind me disappeared into darkness as I reached the end of the hotel floor. I looked back only once. Room 211 still showed a thin line of warm light beneath its door. It was the only room that hadn't surrendered to the quiet. For a strange moment, I wondered whether the man sleeping inside would ever wake. Then I realized the thought no longer frightened me. It only made me sad. A narrow staircase descended toward the manager's offices. The carpet gave way to worn wooden steps, and the familiar smell of old cedar slowly faded behind me. In its place came another scent. Warm dust. The kind that rises gently when sunlight touches books that haven't been opened for years. Except there was no sunlight here. Only the pale glow of my flashlight. The manager's office sat behind a frosted glass door with faded gold lettering. Management. Most of the letters had peeled away. The door wasn't locked. It opened with a quiet sigh. The office looked frozen in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. A wooden desk faced the window. Ledgers rested in careful stacks. A calendar still hung on the wall, open to a month that had ended decades ago. An old coat stood neatly on a rack beside the filing cabinet. Nothing appeared disturbed. It felt less abandoned than forgotten. I stepped inside. Dust floated lazily through the beam of my flashlight, turning slowly as though time moved differently here. Then I heard it. A telephone. One sharp ring. Clear. Gentle. The sound came from somewhere behind the desk. I found it resting beside an open ledger. A black rotary telephone. Its surface gleamed despite the dust surrounding everything else. It rang again. I stared at it. No telephone line connected to the wall. The cord ended neatly beside the desk. Yet the bell continued. Ring. Silence. Ring. I laughed quietly under my breath. Not because anything was amusing, because after everything the theater had shown me, a ringing telephone somehow felt almost ordinary. Still, I hesitated. My father disliked answering calls late at night. If someone really needs you, he'd say, "They'll call again." This caller certainly had. The telephone rang a third time. I lifted the receiver. The line was silent. Not empty. Occupied. I could hear breathing. Soft. Steady. Someone remained there, listening. Neither of us spoke. Nearly half a minute passed that way. Finally, I whispered, "Hello." The breathing continued. Slow. Calm. Almost familiar. Then a voice answered. Not loudly. Not harshly. It sounded like someone speaking from another room. "You stayed?" Only 2 words. Before I could reply, the line went quiet. Not disconnected. Simply silent. I lowered the receiver back into its cradle. Immediately, the telephone rang again. I frowned. The sound felt closer this time, as though the bell had moved nearer to me. Against my better judgment, I answered. Again. Breathing. Again. Silence. Then, "You found the hotel." My fingers tightened around the receiver. The voice hadn't asked a question. It already knew. "Who are you?" I whispered. The breathing paused. For the first time, I thought I recognized it. Not the voice. The rhythm. Slow. Measured. Exactly the way my father breathed when he fell asleep in his old armchair after dinner. The thought settled quietly over me. Then the line went dead. No click. No farewell. Only absence. I placed the receiver down once more. This time I stepped away from the desk. The telephone remained silent for perhaps 10 seconds. Then it rang again. I didn't answer. The bell echoed gently through the office. Patient. Never hurried. Ring. I walked toward the filing cabinet. Ring. Old folders filled the drawers. Maintenance reports. Payroll sheets. Movie schedules. Ring. I opened another drawer. Guest records. Most names had faded beyond reading. One remained perfectly clear. Mine. The date beside it matched the photograph from room 211. 15 years earlier. Length of stay. 1 night. I closed the drawer immediately. Behind me, ring. The telephone refused to stop. I walked toward the office door. Ring. Another. Then another. Each separated by the same calm pause. It no longer sounded impatient, only persistent, as though someone knew I would eventually return. My hand rested on the doorknob. The ringing stopped. Complete silence settled across the office. I waited. Nothing. Perhaps it had finally ended. I opened the door. Before stepping outside, curiosity overcame me. Just once more. I glanced back. The telephone sat exactly where I'd left it, perfectly still. Then, without warning, the receiver lifted by itself, only an inch, just enough to leave the cradle. No hand touched it. No wire pulled it. It simply rose. A quiet voice drifted through the tiny speaker, not speaking to me, speaking as me, word for word. I stayed. The sentence echoed softly around the office. It was my own voice. Calm, tired, certain. The receiver settled gently back into place. I left the office without another glance. The hallway outside welcomed me with familiar stillness. I had almost reached the staircase when the telephone rang once more. Only once. This time, I kept walking. I didn't answer. Some conversations become more dangerous the longer they continue. As I disappeared around the corner, the ringing never returned. Only the faint sound of someone gently replacing a receiver followed me into the darkness. The quiet click of the receiver lingered behind me as I descended the stairs. It wasn't loud enough to echo. It simply stayed in my thoughts, repeating itself the way certain memories do when the night grows long. I reached the lobby again. The theater seemed different, not because anything had changed, because I had. Every strange room, every impossible hallway, every silent performance had begun to feel less like separate mysteries and more like pieces of the same story. I just didn't know whose story it was. The front doors stood exactly where I had first found them. For the first time in what felt like hours, I stepped outside without hesitation. The night had settled comfortably over the town. The clouds were gone. Stars shimmered between the branches overhead. Across the empty street, the diner remained dark. Its windows reflected only the theater's faded marquee. I breathed deeply. The cool air carried another unexpected scent. Fresh gasoline. It drifted gently across the parking lot beside the theater. Not overwhelming. Just enough to remind me of old service stations where my father stopped during long summer drives. He always insisted on filling the tank before it reached half empty. "You never know where the next station might be," he'd say. Standing there, I wished I'd listened to more of his ordinary advice. The parking lot stretched farther than I remembered. Dozens of abandoned cars rested beneath towering oak trees whose branches reached over them like quiet guardians. Every vehicle wore the same patient layer of dust. Some had flat tires. Others showed faded paint or cracked windshields. A few looked almost new. They sat in careful rows, as though their owners had parked them before a movie and never returned. The theater rose silently behind me. Its broken marquee watched over them all. I walked between the cars. My footsteps crunched softly across scattered leaves. The gasoline smell grew stronger near the center of the lot. I followed it. A dark green sedan waited beneath the largest tree. Its paint still held a faint shine beneath the moonlight. Unlike the other vehicles, its windows were perfectly clean. No dust, no fallen leaves. I stopped beside it. The driver's door stood slightly open. Only an inch. I looked inside. The seats appeared untouched. A folded road map rested on the passenger seat. Keys hung from the ignition. No one occupied the car. The dashboard clock glowed softly. 8:17. I smiled sadly. Of course it did. My reflection drifted across the driver's window. For a heartbeat, I thought someone else stood beside me. When I looked directly, there was only my own shadow stretching across the pavement. I reached toward the door. Before my fingers touched it, the engine started. Smoothly, quietly, as though someone had turned the key. I stepped back. The headlights came alive. Warm beams swept across the empty parking lot before settling directly on the theater entrance. Not the road, not the exit, only the front doors. The engine idled gently, waiting. I looked through the windshield. No driver sat behind the wheel. The steering wheel remained perfectly still. The gearshift rested in park, yet the engine purred with calm confidence. The memory arrived before I could stop it. I was 14. My father had finally begun teaching me to drive. I kept staring at the steering wheel instead of the road. He laughed softly. "The car already knows where it is," he said. "You need to know where you're going." At the time, I thought he was joking. Now those words felt strangely different. The headlights continued pointing toward the theater. Inviting. Patient. I walked around the sedan once. The license plate had rusted beyond reading. The trunk stood closed. Every tire remained fully inflated. It looked ready for a journey, just not away from here. A faint breeze stirred the branches overhead. Dry leaves drifted slowly onto the hood. They settled there without sound. The engine continued running. Then, the driver's door eased shut. No slam, only a gentle click. The locks engaged by themselves. I heard each one. 1, 2, 3, 4. The headlights brightened. Inside the car, the radio crackled softly. Only static. Then, through the gentle hiss, music emerged. An old orchestral melody. The same one I had heard beneath the theater in the forgotten orchestra pit. It played quietly, almost as though someone inside had turned the volume low out of courtesy. I stood listening. The music carried that same bittersweet warmth, wrapping old memories around every note. When it ended, the radio returned to silence. The engine stopped. The headlights went dark. The parking lot became still again. I took one slow step toward the driver's window. On the inside of the glass, someone had traced 4 words through a thin layer of mist. "You're almost home." I stared at them. The letters looked fresh. A tiny drop of moisture slipped down the window before disappearing. I lifted one hand toward the glass. Just before my fingertips reached it, every light inside the theater went out. The marquee faded. The lobby vanished into darkness. The parking lot seemed to hold its breath. Then, somewhere behind me, a car door closed. Not the green sedan. Another one, farther away. I turned immediately. Moonlight rested across dozens of silent vehicles. Every door remained shut. Every window reflected empty trees. No movement. No driver. Nothing at all. I stood there for several long moments before facing the theater again. The words on the driver's window had vanished. Only my own reflection remained. I walked back toward the entrance without looking between the rows of parked cars again. As I reached the front doors, I caught one last glimpse of the parking lot from the corner of my eye. Every car was dark, except one. Its taillights glowed faintly red in the distance. Then they slipped quietly behind the trees, as though someone had driven away without making a sound. I watched the red taillights disappear until the trees swallowed them completely. The parking lot became quiet again. Not empty. Quiet. There's a difference. An empty place feels abandoned. A quiet place feels as though someone is waiting for you to stop listening. I slipped back inside the theater. The front doors closed behind me with their familiar sigh, and the scent of gasoline faded into the old smell of worn velvet and aged wood. I noticed something else, too. The building no longer felt cold. It carried a gentle warmth, as though people had been living inside it all along. The thought stayed with me as I wandered behind the stage once more. The curtains hung exactly where I had left them. The props remained untouched. Even the blank script rested on the small table where I had placed it earlier. Everything appeared ordinary, until I noticed the door. I was certain it hadn't been there before. It was narrow, painted white, no handle on the outside, only a small brass latch. There wasn't a sign, no number, nothing to explain why it existed. Curiosity had carried me this far already. I lifted the latch. The door opened inward without a sound. I expected another hallway, another dressing room, perhaps another impossible staircase. Instead, I found a small house, not a room built to resemble one. An actual house. A tiny front porch stretched beneath a hanging lantern that glowed with soft yellow light. White curtains framed 2 windows, and flower boxes rested beneath them, though the flowers had long since faded. I stepped across the threshold. The theater disappeared behind me. A narrow stone path led to the porch. The night air felt warmer here. The scent that greeted me stopped me in place. Fresh bread. Someone had baked only moments ago. The smell drifted gently from an open kitchen window, carrying memories I hadn't visited in years. My mother loved baking on rainy afternoons. The entire house would fill with that same comforting fragrance, and my father always claimed he could tell what she was making before he opened the front door. For one impossible moment, I almost expected them both to step outside. The porch boards creaked softly beneath my feet. The front door stood open. I knocked anyway. 3 gentle taps. No answer. I stepped inside. The living room glowed beneath a single lamp. Everything looked lived in. A knitted blanket rested across the sofa. A pair of reading glasses lay open beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. A teacup sat on a coaster, steam no longer rising but not yet gone completely cold. Someone had been here. Recently. I walked slowly through the room. Books filled the shelves. Family photographs lined the mantel. At first, they looked ordinary. Parents, children, birthday parties, summer picnics. Then one photograph caught my eye. The family smiled warmly toward the camera. Except their faces had become blurred. Not damaged, not scratched away. Simply replaced by smooth, empty shapes. I frowned. Another photograph. Same thing. The bodies remained. The clothing. The background. Only the faces were gone. As I continued along the mantel, something changed. The next picture held clear faces again. Only they weren't the same people. They were mine. Every person. Every age. Every smile. My face stared back from every frame. A little boy blowing out birthday candles. A teenager holding a fishing rod, an old man sitting beneath a tree, lives that weren't mine. Yet somehow, familiar, a chill settled quietly over me. I stepped away from the mantel. The furniture began stirring old memories. The armchair near the fireplace matched one from my grandparents' house. The small wooden clock reminded me of my first apartment. The rug beneath my shoes carried the same pattern my parents had owned when I was young. Nothing belonged together, yet everything belonged to me, or to someone I might have been. A hallway stretched toward the back of the house. Its walls displayed more family portraits. I almost didn't look. Almost. Every frame now held only one person. Me, standing beside people whose faces remained blank. The farther I walked, the older I became. 30, 40, 60, 80. Each photograph showed a life I had never lived. Each looked strangely peaceful. The hallway ended at a small kitchen. A loaf of bread rested on the table beside a neatly folded dish towel. It was still warm. Without thinking, I touched the crust. Soft, fresh. Someone had removed it from the oven only minutes earlier. A chair scraped gently across the floor. I turned immediately. The kitchen remained empty. The chair stood exactly where it had been. I looked toward the table again. 2 slices of bread had appeared on a plate. Butter rested beside them. A second chair now faced the first. Waiting. I remembered sitting across from my father after everyone else had gone to bed. Those late-night conversations had never been about important things. Whether books, whether birds ever became tired of flying. I missed those conversations more than I ever admitted. The second chair remained empty, patient, inviting. I couldn't bring myself to sit down. Instead, I walked toward the front door. I reached for the handle. It wouldn't move. I tried again. Nothing. The lock hadn't turned. The door simply refused to open. I crossed to the nearest window. Outside, the theater stage stretched beyond the glass. Not a neighborhood, not a street. Rows of red curtains, stage lights, empty seats. The little house stood inside the theater after all. Or perhaps the theater stood inside the house. I no longer knew which answer frightened me more. Behind me, one of the photographs fell gently from the wall. The glass didn't break. It landed face up on the wooden floor. I looked down. The picture showed me sitting at the kitchen table, smiling, across from someone whose face had not yet been replaced. Before I could see who it was, the image slowly faded until only the empty room remained. The photograph lay on the floor long after the image disappeared. I left it where it had fallen. Something told me the house preferred its memories undisturbed, even the ones it could no longer keep. The kitchen remained warm behind me. The fresh bread still rested on the table beside the untouched butter, and the second chair continued waiting with quiet patience. I never sat down. Some invitations become harder to refuse the longer you consider them. Instead, I returned to the front hallway. The door that refused to open remained exactly the same. I rested my hand against it for a moment, feeling the smooth painted wood beneath my fingertips. Then I noticed something else. A narrow doorway stood beneath the staircase. It was so small I almost mistook it for a storage cupboard. The brass knob had darkened with age. A tiny keyhole sat beneath it. No key, only the empty lock. Without knowing why, I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers touched cold metal. The brass key. I had never placed it there. Yet I recognized it immediately. It hung beneath the manager's desk the first time I entered his office. I remembered thinking it looked too polished compared with everything around it. Apparently, the theater remembered too. The key smelled faintly of smoke when I lifted it into the light. Not fresh smoke. The quiet scent that lingers on old fireplaces long after the last fire has gone out. My grandfather's workshop carried that same fragrance every winter. He heated it with a little iron stove that always seemed older than the building itself. I smiled at the memory. Then I slid the key into the lock. It turned without resistance. The little door opened inward. Beyond it waited another room. Impossible. Far larger than the tiny doorway should have allowed. Its ceiling rose nearly 20 feet overhead. Bookshelves covered every wall from floor to ceiling. A fireplace rested along one side, filled with gray ash but no fire. A long dining table stood in the center beneath a crystal chandelier. Nothing carried dust. Nothing looked abandoned. The room had been waiting. Quietly, patiently, as though someone had stepped outside only moments ago. I entered slowly. The air felt comfortable. Not warm, not cool, simply familiar. My footsteps disappeared into a thick-woven rug whose pattern stirred a vague memory I couldn't quite reach. At the far end of the room stood a wooden coat rack. One coat hung there, dark gray wool. Mine, the same one I had worn when I first arrived at the theater. I looked down at myself. I was still wearing it. Yet another one waited on the rack, neatly brushed, perfectly arranged. Beside it rested my old leather satchel, the one I had lost during a move nearly 10 years ago. A pair of gloves lay folded on the small table beneath them. My gloves. The tiny tear near one thumb left no room for doubt. The room had collected pieces of my life. Not copies, the originals. I approached the fireplace. Family photographs covered the mantel. Unlike the house behind the stage, every face remained perfectly clear. My parents smiled from one frame, my grandparents from another. Then, a photograph I had never seen before. My father stood inside this very room, older than I remembered him. His hand rested gently on the back of the chair nearest the fireplace. He wasn't smiling. He looked peaceful, as though he had finally stopped searching for something. I reached toward the frame. My fingers paused just before touching the glass. Somehow, I already knew it would be warm. Behind me, the chandelier gave a tiny shimmer. Not swinging, just catching light that hadn't been there a moment before. I toned. The dining table was set for dinner. White plates, polished silverware, crystal glasses, 25 place settings. Every chair occupied, not by people, by carefully folded theater programs. Each rested where a guest should have been. One program stood open. The others remained closed. I walked to it. The cover carried tonight's date. Inside appeared a cast list. Every role had been filled. The final line waited alone at the bottom of the page. Caretaker. No name. Just an empty space. A fountain pen rested across the paper. Fresh ink darkened its tip. I didn't pick it up. The silence inside the room felt too complete, like a library after everyone had gone home, or a church waiting for the first prayer of the morning. Instead, I wandered toward the bookshelves. Hundreds of journals filled them. Every spine carried a year. Then, this year, I carefully removed the newest volume. It opened easily. Most of its pages were blank. Only the first few contained writing. I recognized the careful handwriting immediately. It matched the janitor's notebook. The final completed sentence read, "He has found the room." Below it, one empty line remained. Waiting. I closed the journal. Slowly, returned it to the shelf. The room had offered me enough. As I turned back toward the little doorway, something caught my eye. The coat rack. Only one coat remained now. The extra one had vanished. I looked down. I was no longer wearing mine. I couldn't remember taking it off. A faint uneasiness settled quietly over me. I reached for the rack. The remaining coat fit perfectly. Inside its pocket rested a folded note. Only 4 words had been written. "You'll need this soon." I slipped the note back where I found it. Then I walked toward the tiny doorway. It remained open. The hallway beyond looked exactly as before. Just before crossing the threshold, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. Every chair at the dining table was empty again. The theater programs had disappeared. Only one place setting remained. The chair at the head of the table. Its plate held a brass key, identical to the one still resting in my hand. I stepped into the hallway. The small door closed gently behind me. I did not try the handle. Some rooms are less frightening when they believe you've already agreed to return. The small door remained closed behind me. I stood there for a long time, looking at the plain wooden surface. No handle, no keyhole, no sign that a room had ever existed there. Only an ordinary wall beneath the staircase. I touched the place where the door had been. Nothing. The theater had hidden another part of itself again. Or perhaps it had hidden another part of me. I continued through the hallway without searching for another entrance. For the first time since arriving, I wasn't chasing answers. I was simply walking. The theater had grown quieter. Not the empty silence from before. Something softer. Almost like the peaceful moments after everyone leaves a house and the rooms finally become still. I returned to the auditorium. The doors opened without resistance. Inside, the seats waited beneath the dim glow of a few remaining lights. No audience, no applause, no impossible performance. Only the stage, only the empty rows. I walked down the aisle slowly. My footsteps felt different now, less like an intruder, more like a visitor who had stayed long enough to understand the rules. Near the front row, I stopped. The seat where my name was gone. In its place stood another, older, worn. The fabric had faded from years of use, and the wooden armrest carried tiny scratches from countless hands. A dark hat rested on the cushion. I recognized it before I reached for it. My father's hat, the one he wore almost every winter, the one I remembered hanging beside the front door when I was a child. I picked it up carefully. The fabric carried a faint scent of tobacco, not smoke, just a quiet trace left behind by someone who had spent many evenings sitting in the same chair, thinking the same thoughts. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I was back in my childhood home. My father sitting in the living room, the television playing softly in the background, a newspaper folded beside him. That simple sound of someone turning a page. I had forgotten how much comfort existed in ordinary moments, how much I missed them. I lowered the hat back onto the seat. The theater remained silent. No message appeared. No hidden voice spoke. No impossible image changed before me. And somehow, that felt more meaningful than all the things that had happened before. I sat beside the empty seat. Not in it, just beside it. For the first time, I allowed myself to stop wondering. Where had the theater come from? Why did it know my memories? Why did it know my father? The questions remained, but they no longer felt urgent. Some mysteries aren't locked doors waiting to be opened. Some are windows. You look through them. You remember. Then you keep walking. I thought about something my father once told me while we were driving through an unfamiliar town. We passed an old house with broken windows and a garden full of weeds. I asked him why nobody fixed it. He looked at the house for a moment and said, maybe someone is taking care of it in a different way. At the time, I didn't understand. Now I wondered if he had been talking about more than abandoned buildings. The stage lights slowly brightened. Not all of them, just enough to reveal the empty performance space. A single chair appeared at the center of the stage. No one carried it there. No one placed it down. It simply waited beneath the light. On the seat rested another hat. Not my father's. Mine. Older. Worn. Familiar. I looked down at the hat beside me, then toward the stage. Two versions of the same object. Two places. Two choices. The theater was asking something. But for once, I didn't feel pressure to answer. I stood. The old seat remained behind me. The hat stayed where it was. I didn't take it. Some things are meant to be remembered, not carried. I walked toward the stage. The chair waited beneath the light. As I approached, I noticed something carved into its wooden frame. A name. Not mine. Not my father's. A name that had been there for a very long time. I brushed away a layer of dust. Only then did I understand. The chair wasn't waiting for someone new. It was waiting for someone who had already been there. I stepped back. The theater became completely quiet. No distant footsteps. No hidden music. No whispers from forgotten rooms. Just a gentle stillness of a place finally resting. I looked toward the entrance. The doors stood open. Beyond them, darkness filled the hallway. For the first time all night, I didn't feel the need to leave. I didn't feel trapped either. I simply understood. The theater wasn't holding me. It was showing me something. And perhaps I had spent my whole life walking toward this moment without knowing. I returned to the front row. The hat on my father's seat was gone. In its place rested a small note. I picked it up. Only one sentence was written. You finally stopped looking. I folded the paper carefully. Then I sat beside the empty seat. And for the first time since entering the theater, I allowed myself to listen to the silence. I remained in the auditorium until I stopped expecting something to happen. That was the strangest part. After everything the theater had shown me, I thought I would always be waiting for the next impossible thing. A voice from an empty room. A door opening by itself. A forgotten object appearing where it didn't belong. But nothing came. The theater simply existed. Quietly, like it had before I arrived. I eventually stood and walked toward the lobby. The note from my father's seat remained folded in my pocket. I didn't read it again. Some words lose their meaning when you stare at them too long. The hallway outside the auditorium looked different. Not changed. Restored. The peeling wallpaper was smooth. The cracked lamps were whole. The old posters hanging along the walls had regained their original colors. I stopped near one that had once been faded beyond recognition. Now I could read every detail. Opening night. The date beneath it was nearly impossible to believe. Decades ago, before I was born, before my father was born, before anyone I knew had ever heard of this place. Yet the theater looked ready for that very night. I reached the lobby and stopped. The abandoned entrance had disappeared. The broken ticket counter, the dusty floors, the damaged walls, all gone. In their place stood a beautiful old theater lobby glowing beneath warm golden lights. The ceiling shone with polished wood. The marble floor reflected the chandeliers above. A gentle fragrance filled the room. Fresh popcorn, polished wood, clean fabric. It smelled like a place that had never been forgotten, like a place waiting for guests. People began arriving. At first, I thought I was seeing another memory, a performance, another illusion created by the theater. But these people were different. They weren't silent figures. They weren't shadows sitting in empty seats. They laughed. They smiled. They adjusted their coats. Children held their parents' hands as they entered through the doors. A man removed his hat politely while speaking to the ticket clerk. A woman carried a small bouquet of flowers wrapped in paper. Everything felt normal, almost painfully normal. I stepped aside as they walked past me. No one noticed. Not one person looked in my direction. I moved closer to the ticket counter. The young man behind it smiled warmly at each visitor. 2 for the evening show. Balcony seats, please. Thank you. The conversations blended together. Soft, ordinary, human. I realized how much I missed ordinary sounds. People talking without fear. Footsteps without mystery. Laughter without an echo. A family walked past me. A father, a mother, a little boy wearing a small coat. The child dropped a toy near my feet. I bent down and picked it up. For a moment, I thought about returning it. Then I remembered. They couldn't see me. The boy turned. His eyes met mine. My hand froze. He looked directly at me. Not through me. At me. He tilted his head slightly, as if he recognized someone familiar. Then his father called his name. The child looked away. When he turned back, I was invisible again. I placed the toy on the counter beside the entrance. A few seconds later, another child picked it up. The same child, the same coat, the same smile. But he never looked at me again. I wandered deeper into the lobby. The walls displayed photographs of the theater's history. Opening nights, performances, crowds gathering outside, actors standing beneath the marquee. In every photograph, I noticed the same thing. A small space, an empty place, a person missing from every crowd. The caretaker. I didn't see a face, only the space where someone should have been. The theater had always needed someone, not to repair the building, not to protect it, to remember it. The thought felt strangely comforting. I walked toward the auditorium doors. They opened before I touched them. Inside, the audience had already taken their seats. The stage curtains were closed. The room glowed beautifully. Every seat was filled. Every person waited. But nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The strange part was, I no longer felt afraid. I walked down the aisle. No one noticed me. I reached the stage. The curtains began to open. Slowly, a spotlight appeared. Not on an actor, not on a performance. On me. I looked back toward the audience. Every face remained turned toward the stage. Toward me. But there was no expectation. No demand. Only recognition. Like they had known this moment would come. The little boy from the lobby sat near the front. He smiled faintly. Then he whispered something I couldn't hear. The curtains closed again. The lights dimmed. When they returned, the auditorium was empty. The old theater had returned. The cracked seats, the faded walls, the quiet air. I stood alone on the stage. But something had changed. The loneliness no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like a responsibility. A role passed from one person to another. I walked back into the lobby. The opening night world was gone. Only one thing remained. The ticket counter. On top of it rested a single admission ticket. Fresh, clean, waiting. I picked it up. The name printed on it wasn't mine. Not this time. Someone else's name rested beneath the faded theater logo. Someone who had not arrived yet. I looked toward the entrance. The doors were closed. But beyond them, I heard footsteps approaching. Slow, uncertain, familiar, the same way mine had sounded hours earlier. I held the ticket in my hand. And for the first time, I understood why the theater had never truly been abandoned. It was never waiting for a show to begin. It was waiting for someone to come home. The footsteps outside the theater stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. I stood behind the ticket counter, holding the new admission ticket, listening to the silence beyond the front doors. A part of me expected the visitor to enter. Another part hoped they wouldn't, because I finally understood what the theater had been trying to show me. It wasn't a place that trapped people. It was a place that remembered them. And memories have a way of asking to be shared. The footsteps returned. Closer. 3 slow steps. Then the front doors opened. A traveler stepped inside. A stranger. A person carrying a worn backpack and looking around with the same uncertain curiosity I must have carried when I first arrived. The visitor looked at the faded walls, the old posters, the empty ticket counter, the broken marquee visible through the glass. Confusion crossed their face. The same confusion I remembered seeing in my own reflection. I wanted to speak, to warn them, to tell them about the ticket, the theater, the rooms that shouldn't exist, the things hidden behind ordinary doors. But no sound came. My voice belonged to another part of the building now. Or perhaps it belonged to the theater itself. The visitor approached the counter. Their fingers brushed the edge of the wood. The exact same place where I had found my ticket. The exact same moment. The theater lights flickered softly above us. Not like a warning, like a welcome. The visitor looked around, then noticed the ticket resting in my hand. Their eyes met mine. For one brief moment. They could see me. I don't know why. Maybe some people are meant to see what others cannot. Maybe the theater chooses carefully. The visitor didn't run, didn't scream. They simply looked at me, waiting. I placed the ticket on the counter. They reached for it. The moment their fingers touched the paper, the theater changed. Not dramatically, quietly, the way a house changes when someone turns on a lamp. The dust disappeared from the ticket counter. The lights above grew warmer. The old curtains near the entrance moved gently. The building was awake again. I stepped back. The visitor looked down at the ticket. Their expression shifted. A small amount of fear. A small amount of wonder. Exactly what I had felt. I wanted to tell them everything. But the words remained trapped inside. Instead, I looked toward the auditorium. The doors were open. Inside, every seat was filled. The audience had returned. Not the silent figures from before. Not the lost faces. Everyone. Every person who had ever passed through the theater. Every person who had left something behind. Every person who had been remembered. They sat quietly beneath the soft lights, waiting. The visitor looked inside. I watched their face change. They saw it too. The endless rows of people. The impossible room. The stage waiting beneath the curtain. They stepped closer. I followed. Not beside them. Behind them. The way someone once followed me. The auditorium felt warmer now. The scent of old velvet filled the room. Comforting. Familiar. Like an old book opened after many years. The visitor reached the center aisle. The same place where I had stood. The same place where I had looked at the audience and wondered what they wanted from me. Now I knew. They wanted nothing. They were simply witnessing. The visitor looked toward the stage. The curtains opened. No actors appeared. No performance began. Only an empty chair waited beneath the spotlight. The visitor glanced back at me. I almost smiled, because I remembered that moment. The uncertainty, the questions, the quiet fear of not knowing what came next. Then I noticed something. The chair on stage was different. It wasn't the one that had waited for me. It was newer, cleaner, prepared for someone else. A new beginning. The visitor slowly walked toward it. I remained near the entrance. The distance between us felt strangely familiar, like watching someone step onto a path you once walked yourself. The audience remained silent. No applause, no movement, only attention. The visitor stopped beside the chair. For a long moment, they didn't sit, I understood. Some choices need time. The theater never forced anyone. It only waited. Eventually, the visitor placed one hand on the chair. The lights above softened. The room became still, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because my journey was ending, because it wasn't ending at all. It was changing. The theater had not taken my life away. It had given me another way to continue, a different purpose, a quieter one. The visitor finally Saturday. The moment they did, the auditorium lights dimmed, the audience disappeared, the stage went dark, and the theater returned to silence. But this silence felt different. Not lonely, not empty, complete. I walked back toward the lobby. The front doors waited beyond the hallway. I knew I could open them. I knew I could step outside. But when I reached the entrance, I stopped. Through the glass, I saw the old road, the trees, the town, the world I had once been desperate to return to. It looked peaceful, beautiful, far away. I placed my hand against the door, then lowered it. Some places are prisons. Others are homes you never knew you were searching for. Behind me, deep inside the theater, a single seat creaked. The sound was gentle, almost welcoming. I didn't turn around. I already knew someone was waiting for the next performance to begin. I remained near the entrance for a long time. The theater behind me had gone quiet again. Not the uneasy silence I had known when I first arrived. This was something gentler, the kind of silence that comes after a long conversation, when there is nothing left to explain. The front door stood before me. Beyond the glass, the outside world waited. The road, the trees, the distant lights of the town. Everything looked exactly as it should. Normal. I placed my hand against the door handle. For a moment, I remembered how badly I wanted this. To leave, to return home, to wake up in my own bed and convince myself that the theater had been nothing more than a strange night I would never fully understand. But my hand did not turn the handle. Not because I was afraid, because I no longer knew what I was returning to. The theater had shown me pieces of my life I had forgotten, moments I had buried beneath years of routine. My father's voice, my mother's kitchen, the small memories that disappear quietly until something brings them back. I had spent so much time searching for answers that I forgot what I was actually looking for. Maybe I wasn't searching for the truth. Maybe I was searching for something I had lost. I walked away from the entrance. The lobby lights remained low, casting soft pools of gold across the floor. The ticket counter stood empty except for the new admission ticket waiting beneath the glass. Someone else's name was printed there. Someone else's beginning. I thought about the first ticket I had found, the one carrying my own name. At the time, it felt like a warning. Now, I wondered if it had been an invitation. The theater had never chased me, never forced me through its doors. It had only opened them. I walked through the lobby slowly. The faded posters along the walls seemed less damaged now. The faces of forgotten actors looked almost peaceful beneath the dim lights. The old velvet curtains near the auditorium entrance moved gently. A quiet draft passed through the room. It carried the scent of extinguished candles, the same smell that remained after birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings when everyone had gone home. I thought about all the celebrations I barely remembered, the cakes, the photographs, the voices, the people who were once part of my everyday life. Time takes more than we realize. It doesn't always take things away completely. Sometimes it simply places them somewhere we cannot reach. I entered the auditorium one final time. The seats waited beneath the darkened chandeliers. No audience, no performance, no impossible scenes. Just an empty theater, beautiful in its own way. I walked down the aisle and stopped near the stage. The chair that had waited for the new visitor was gone. The stage was empty. The curtains were closed. For once, nothing asked me to understand. I sat in the front row, not in the marked seat, not in any special place, just an ordinary seat. And I listened. The building had many sounds. The quiet movement of old wood, the faint shifting of fabric, the distant settling of rooms above. They no longer felt like warnings. They felt like signs of life. My father used to say that every house had its own language. Some creaked, some whispered, some simply became quiet when nobody was there. I never believed him. Until now. I don't know how long I stayed there. Minutes, hours, maybe longer. Time inside the theater had never behaved like time outside. Eventually, the lights above the stage began to fade, one by one, not because something was ending, because everything was resting. The theater had closed many times before. It knew how. I stood and walked back toward the lobby. The exit signs glowed softly along the walls. This time, they all pointed in the same direction. The front doors. The path was clear. I stopped before them. The glass showed my reflection. For the first time since entering the theater, I recognized myself completely. Not the younger version from photographs. Not the person the rooms had created. Just me. Older. Changed. Carrying memories I had almost forgotten. I opened the door. Cold night air into the lobby. The scent of trees and distant rain followed it inside. The world outside remained quiet, waiting. I stepped forward, then stopped. Behind me, the theater lights went dark. Not all at once. Slowly, room by room. The lobby, the balcony, the stage, the hidden holes. Everything returned to sleep. I looked back through the open doorway. For a brief moment, I saw the empty auditorium, the rows of seats, the closed curtains, the quiet stage. Then the view disappeared. The front doors began moving. On their own, I didn't resist. I didn't reach for the handle. I simply watched as they closed gently between me and the theater. The last thing I heard before the doors met was not a voice, not footsteps, not music, only the soft sound of a candle being extinguished somewhere deep inside. Then there was nothing, no invitation, no warning. I used to believe abandoned places were defined by what they had lost. Broken windows, empty rooms, forgotten names written on walls. I thought an empty building was a place where something had ended. I was wrong. Some places are not empty. They are simply waiting. Years have passed since that night at the theater. At least, I think years have passed. Time feels different here. The seasons outside the building continue changing. But inside, the moments move more slowly. A single morning can feel like a whole lifetime. A single memory can feel like yesterday. I no longer count the days. I stopped trying to understand how long I have been here. The theater does not ask me to measure time. It only asks me to remember. The strange thing is, I don't feel trapped. I thought I would. When the doors closed behind me, I expected fear. I expected regret. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The theater became quiet again, but it was not the silence of something abandoned. It was the silence of something cared for. Every morning, I walked through the lobby. I checked the old ticket counter. I straightened the faded posters. I make sure the lights near the stage continue glowing softly. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things people rarely notice until they disappear. The velvet curtains have become familiar to me. The wooden floors, the old seats, the quiet rooms hidden above and beneath the theater. I know them all now. They no longer feel like mysteries. They feel like memories. Sometimes I sit in the empty auditorium and think about the first night I entered, the fear I carried, the questions I couldn't answer, the way I searched every hallway hoping to find a reason for everything. Now I understand. Not every place keeps secrets because it wants to hide them. Sometimes secrets are kept because they are precious. The theater remembers everyone who passed through, every visitor, every performer, every person who sat beneath the lights and dreamed of something more. Nobody truly disappears here. They become part of the story. I think about my father often. His words follow me more than I ever expected. Abandoned places don't stay empty forever. I laughed when he first said it. I thought he was being poetic. Maybe he was. But maybe he also knew something I didn't. Maybe he had visited places like this. Maybe he understood that some doors open only when someone is ready to walk through them. Tonight, as I sit near the front row, I notice something different. The theater feels awake. Not in the way it did before. No strange sounds. No impossible rooms appearing. Just a quiet feeling that someone is arriving. I stand. I walk toward the lobby. The old front doors wait beneath the faded marquee. The same doors I entered long ago. Outside, the road is covered in morning mist. A traveler walks toward the theater. A stranger, carrying a small bag, looking tired, confused, curious, exactly the way I looked. They stop beneath the broken sign. They notice the single bulb glowing above the entrance. They look around, wondering why a place abandoned for so long would still have light. I almost smile, because I know the question. I asked it too. The traveler approaches the doors. They hesitate. Their hand reaches toward the handle. For a moment, they consider walking away. I understand that feeling. The choice matters. The theater never forces anyone. It only opens the door. The traveler steps inside. The same quiet expression crosses their face. Confusion, wonder, a little fear. I stand behind the ticket counter. The admission ticket waits exactly where it always does. Fresh, clean, ready. The traveler looks around the lobby. Their eyes move over the empty theater, the faded posters, the old wood, the silent halls. Then they see me. This time, I don't disappear. They can see me clearly, the way I saw those who came before. For a moment, neither of us speaks. There is no need. Some things are understood without words. I gently slide the ticket across the counter. The traveler looks down at their name. Their expression changes. The same expression I once wore. The moment when a person realizes a place they found was never really found by accident. I look toward the auditorium. The doors slowly open. Warm light spills into the lobby. The traveler takes one step forward, then another. I follow behind, not because I need to, because this is what I do now. I welcome. I remember. I remain. Inside the auditorium, the seats wait beneath the soft glow. The stage is empty. The curtains are closed. Another story is about to begin. I used to wonder who the theater belonged to. Now I know. It belongs to everyone who needed somewhere to be remembered. The traveler reaches the center aisle. They look back at me. I give a small nod. The same reassurance I once wished someone had given me. Everything will be all right. The lights begin to fade. The doors behind us close gently. And as the theater settles into another quiet evening, I finally understand what my father meant. Abandoned places don't stay empty forever. They wait for someone willing to remember them. And sometimes, they wait for someone willing to stay.